It is a widely accepted fact of life that a single man with a large fortune is inevitably in need of a wife. No matter how little anyone actually knows about the man's own desires when he moves into a new area, the local families instantly lay claim to him, viewing the newcomer as the rightful property of whichever daughter happens to be available. "My dear Mr. Bennet," his wife announced one afternoon, "have you heard that Netherfield Park is finally rented?" Mr. Bennet replied that he had not. "Well, it is," she insisted. "Mrs. Long was just here, and she told me the whole story." Mr. Bennet offered no response. "Don't you want to know who took the lease?" she cried, her patience fraying. "You clearly want to tell me, and I have no objection to hearing it." That was all the invitation she needed. Mrs. Long says Netherfield was taken by a young man from the north of England who has a massive fortune. He came down on Monday in a chaise and four to look at the estate, and he was so thrilled with it that he struck a deal with Mr. Morris right then and there. He takes possession before Michaelmas, and a few of his servants will be in the house by the end of next week. "What is his name?" "Bingley." "Is he married or single?" "Oh, single, my dear. Of course he is. A single man with a vast fortune, 4,000 or 5,000 a year. What a perfect opportunity for our girls." "How so? What does his money have to do with them?" "My dear Mr. Bennet, how can you be so exhausting? You know perfectly well I am thinking of him marrying one of them." "Is that why he settled here, to find a wife?" "To find a wife? Don't be ridiculous. But it is highly likely he will fall in love with one of our daughters, so you must call on him the moment he arrives." "I don't see the need," Mr. Bennet said. "You and the girls can go. Or better yet, send them on their own. You are as beautiful as any of them. If you go, Mr. Bingley might decide he likes you best." "Oh, you flatter me. I certainly had my share of beauty once, but I wouldn't call myself anything extraordinary these days. When a woman has 5 grown daughters, she really ought to stop thinking about her own looks. In those cases, a woman rarely has much beauty left to think about. But really, my dear, you absolutely must visit Mr. Bingley when he moves into the neighborhood. That is more of a commitment than I am willing to make, I assure you. But think of your daughters. Think of the household one of them would have. Sir William and Lady Lucas are firmly planning to call on him for that exact reason, and you know they generally refuse to visit newcomers. You have to go. It will be completely impossible for us to introduce ourselves if you don't do it first." "You worry too much," he said. "I'm sure Mr. Bingley will be thrilled to meet you. I'll even send along a few lines giving my full blessing for him to marry whichever girl he prefers, though I'll have to put in a special good word for my little Lizzie." "I absolutely forbid it. Lizzie is no better than the rest of them. She isn't half as beautiful as Jane, and she isn't nearly as good-natured as Lydia. But you always play favorites with her." "None of them have much to recommend them," Mr. Bennet replied. "They are all just as silly and ignorant as any other young women. But Lizzie does have a bit more sharpness to her than her sisters." "Mr. Bennet, how can you speak so cruelly about your own children? You take absolute delight in tormenting me. You have no pity for my poor nerves." "You misunderstand me, my dear. I have the utmost respect for your nerves. They are old friends of mine. I've been listening to you talk about them with great reverence for at least 20 years. You have no idea how much I suffer. Well, I hope you recover, and live to see 20 young men with 4,000 a year move into the neighborhood. What good would 20 of them do us, if you refuse to visit a single one? Rest assured, my dear, when 20 of them show up, I will visit them all." Mr. Bennet was such a bizarre blend of quick wit, sarcastic humor, quiet reserve, and sudden whims that 23 years of marriage had not been enough for his wife to figure him out. Her own personality was far easier to grasp. She was a woman of low intelligence, limited knowledge, and a wildly unpredictable temper. Whenever she felt dissatisfied, she imagined herself to be suffering from a nervous condition. The sole ambition of her life was to get her daughters married, and her only real comforts were paying social calls and trading local gossip. Despite his constant protests to the contrary, Mr. Bennet was actually one of the first men in the neighborhood to pay his respects to Mr. Bingley. He had fully intended to go all along. He simply preferred to keep his wife entirely in the dark about the matter, right up until the evening after the deed was done. The revelation came about quite naturally. He was watching his second daughter, Elizabeth, as she carefully decorated a new hat, and he suddenly broke the silence. "I certainly hope Mr. Bingley will approve of that, Lizzie," he said. Since we aren't going to call on him, we have absolutely no way of knowing what Mr. Bingley likes, her mother snapped, still simmering with resentment over the issue. You're forgetting the assemblies, Mama, Elizabeth pointed out. Mrs. Long promised to introduce us. Mrs. Bennet scoffed. I doubt Mrs. Long will do anything of the kind. She has 2 nieces of her own to worry about. The woman is selfish and hypocritical, and I don't think much of her at all. Neither do I, Mr. Bennet agreed. So, I am delighted to hear you aren't relying on her for a favor. Rather than dignify this with a response, Mrs. Bennet channeled her mounting frustration toward one of her daughters. For heaven's sake, Kitty, stop that endless coughing. Have a little mercy on my nerves. You're tearing them to pieces. Kitty has terrible timing with her coughs, her father noted mildly. She lacks discretion. I'm not doing it for fun, Kitty whined. She turned to her sister. When is the next ball, Lizzie? A fortnight from tomorrow. Exactly, their mother cried. And Mrs. Long doesn't return from her trip until the day before. It will be completely impossible for her to introduce him, because she won't even know the man herself yet. Well then, my dear, Mr. Bennet said, you will have the upper hand. You can introduce Mr. Bingley to ****. That is impossible, Mr. Bennet, and you know it. How can I introduce them when I haven't met him myself? Why must you tease me so? I respect your caution, he replied. A 2-week acquaintance is hardly anything. You can't truly know a man's character in just 14 days, but if we don't take the leap, someone else certainly will. Mrs. Long and her nieces must take their chances. So, since she would surely see it as a great favor if you refuse to make the introduction, I will simply have to do it myself. The Bennet girls stared at their father in disbelief. Their mother dismissed the offer entirely. Nonsense, absolute nonsense. What exactly do you mean by that? Mr. Bennet asked. Are you saying that the strict rules of introduction are nonsense? I'm afraid I have to disagree with you there. What do you think, Mary? You're a young woman of deep thought. You read massive books and copy out the wisest passages. Mary desperately wanted to offer a profound and sensible observation, but she couldn't quite figure out how to phrase it. While Mary organizes her thoughts, Mr. Bennet continued, let's get back to Mr. Bingley. I am absolutely sick of Mr. Bingley, his wife shouted. Well, I'm very sorry to hear that. Why didn't you say so sooner? If you told me that this morning, I never would have gone to call on him. It really is a shame. But since I've already paid the visit, I'm afraid we're stuck knowing the man. The shock in the room was exactly what he had been aiming for. Mrs. Bennet's astonishment outstripped even her daughter's. Of course, the moment her initial explosion of joy subsided, she immediately began claiming she had known he would do it all along. Oh, you are so wonderful, my dear Mr. Bennet, she cried. But I knew I'd talk you into it eventually. I was certain you loved your daughters too much to let an opportunity like this slip by. Oh, I am so thrilled. And what a brilliant joke, going all the way over there this morning and not saying a single word about it until tonight. You can cough as much as you like now, Kitty, Mr. Bennet said. Thoroughly exhausted by his wife's excessive excitement, he stood up and left the room. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, Mrs. Bennet turned to her daughters. What an incredible father you have, girls. I truly don't know how you'll ever repay him for this kindness, or me, for that matter. Let me tell you, at our age, it isn't exactly fun to go around making new acquaintances every day, but we would do anything for you. Lydia, my sweet, you may be the youngest, but I'll bet Mr. Bingley will ask you to dance at the next ball. Oh, I'm not worried, Lydia declared with bold confidence. I might be the youngest, but I'm also the tallest. The women spent the remainder of the evening happily guessing how soon the young man might return Mr. Bennet's call, and debating exactly when they ought to invite him to dinner. They also noted one more promising detail about their new neighbor. He rode a black horse. Chapter II. Despite the combined efforts of Mrs. Bennet and her 5 daughters, no amount of questioning could extract a satisfactory description of Mr. Bingley from Mr. Bennet. They laid siege to him from every angle, direct interrogations, clever guesses, and roundabout hints, but he dodged them all. In the end, the women were forced to rely on second-hand gossip from their neighbor, Lady Lucas. Her report was glowing. Sir William was completely taken with the young man. Bingley was young, strikingly handsome, perfectly charming, and best of all, he planned to attend the upcoming assembly with a large group of friends. Nothing could be better. A love of dancing was a guaranteed first step toward falling in love, and the Bennet household was suddenly buzzing with vibrant hopes for Mr. Bingley's heart. If I can just see one of my daughters happily settled at Netherfield, Mrs. Bennet told her husband, and all the others just as well married, I won't have another wish in the world. A few days later, Mr. Bingley returned the visit. He sat with Mr. Bennet in the library for about 10 minutes, harboring a quiet hope that he might catch a glimpse of the young ladies whose beauty had been so widely praised. He was out of luck. He saw only their father. The daughters, however, fared slightly better. By peering down from an upper window, they managed to confirm that the newcomer wore a blue coat and rode a black horse. An invitation to dinner was quickly dispatched. Mrs. Bennet had already planned a menu designed to show off her exceptional housekeeping when a reply arrived that derailed everything. Mr. Bingley had urgent business in London the following day and was therefore forced to decline the honor of their invitation. Mrs. Bennet was entirely thrown. She could not fathom what business he could possibly have in town so soon after arriving in Hertfordshire. A dark fear crept into her mind that he might be a restless sort, always flitting from place to place instead of settling down at Netherfield as a gentleman should. Lady Lucas managed to soothe these anxieties by suggesting that Bingley had only gone to London to gather a large party for the upcoming ball. Soon, a rumor circulated that he was bringing 12 women and 7 men with him to the assembly. The Bennet girls despaired at the thought of so much female competition. Fortunately, they were comforted the day before the ball by a revised report. Instead of 12 ladies, he was only bringing 6 from London, his 5 sisters and a cousin. When the Netherfield party finally entered the assembly room, it turned out to be a group of only 5. Mr. Bingley, his 2 sisters, the husband of the eldest, and another young man. Mr. Bingley was an undeniably good-looking gentleman with a warm, open face and easy, natural manners. His sisters were elegant women who carried themselves with the decided air of high fashion. His brother-in-law, Mr. Hurst, looked exactly like what he was, a gentleman of leisure. But it was Bingley's friend, Mr. Darcy, who immediately captured the room's attention. Darcy was tall, with a fine figure, handsome features, and a noble bearing. Within 5 minutes of his arrival, a rumor swept through the crowd that he possessed an income of £10,000 a year. The men admired his stature, and the women readily agreed that he was far better looking than Mr. Bingley. For about half the evening, Darcy was the object of universal admiration. Then, the tide turned. His manners eventually sparked a wave of disgust that thoroughly ruined his popularity. The room discovered that he was proud. He clearly considered himself above his company and had no interest in being pleased. Suddenly, not even his massive estate in Derbyshire could save him from the public consensus that he had a forbidding, disagreeable face, and was entirely unworthy of being compared to his charming friend. Bingley, meanwhile, quickly made himself known to all the most prominent people in the room. He was energetic and open, danced every dance, complained that the ball was closing too early, and even talked of hosting one himself at Netherfield. Such amiable qualities spoke volumes. The contrast between him and his friend could not have been sharper. Mr. Darcy danced only twice, once with Mrs. Hurst and once with Miss Bingley. He flatly refused to be introduced to any other lady, spending the rest of the evening pacing the room and speaking occasionally only to members of his own party. His character was firmly decided. He was the proudest, most disagreeable man in the world, and everyone fervently hoped he would never return. Among his harshest critics was Mrs. Bennet. Her general distaste for his behavior had been sharpened into a fierce personal resentment, simply because he had slighted one of her daughters. Due to a shortage of gentlemen, Elizabeth Bennet had been forced to sit out 2 dances. For part of that time, Mr. Darcy had been standing close enough for her to overhear a conversation between him and Mr. Bingley, who had stepped away from the dancing for a few minutes to urge his friend to join in. "Come on, Darcy," Bingley said. "I have to get you to dance. I hate seeing you standing around by yourself in this stupid way. You really should be dancing." "I certainly will not," Darcy replied. "You know how much I hate it unless I am particularly acquainted with my partner. At an assembly like this, it would be unbearable. Your sisters are engaged, and there isn't another woman in this room whom it wouldn't be a punishment to stand up with." "I wouldn't be as fastidious as you are for a kingdom," Bingley exclaimed. "On my honor, I have never met so many pleasant girls in my life as I have tonight, and as you can see, several of them are uncommonly pretty." "You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room," Darcy said, looking toward the eldest Miss Bennet. Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I've ever laid eyes on. But there is one of her sisters sitting just behind you. She is very pretty, and I imagine she's very agreeable. Let me have my partner introduce you. Which one do you mean? Darcy turned around and looked at Elizabeth for a moment. Catching her eye, he quickly looked away and spoke in a cold voice. She is tolerable, but she isn't handsome enough to tempt me, and I am in no humor at present to give consequence to young ladies who are slighted by other men. You had better go back to your partner and enjoy her smiles. You're wasting your time with me. Bingley took the advice and headed back to the floor. Darcy walked off, leaving Elizabeth with no very cordial feelings toward him. She did, however, recount the story to her friends with great spirit. She had a lively, playful disposition and genuinely delighted in anything ridiculous. Overall, the evening was a tremendous success for the whole family. Mrs. Bennet had watched her eldest daughter be deeply admired by the Netherfield party. Mr. Bingley had danced with Jane twice, and his sisters had gone out of their way to distinguish her. Jane was just as thrilled by this as her mother, though she showed it in her usual quiet way, and Elizabeth shared in her sister's happiness. Mary had overheard herself described to Miss Bingley as the most accomplished girl in the neighborhood. As for Catherine and Lydia, they had managed to secure partners for every single dance, which was all they had yet learned to care about at a ball. They returned in high spirits to Longbourn, the village where they lived and where their family was the principal inhabitants. They found Mr. Bennet still awake. When he had a book in his hands, he lost all track of time, but tonight he also harbored a fair amount of curiosity about how the evening had gone. The ball had generated such splendid expectations. He had secretly hoped to hear that all his wife's grand illusions about the stranger had been disappointed, but he soon realized he was going to hear a very different story. "Oh, my dear Mr. Bennet," she cried as she swept into the library. "We had the most magnificent evening, a most excellent ball. I only wish you had been there. Jane was so admired you can't even imagine. Everyone said how wonderful she looked, and Mr. Bingley thought she was quite beautiful. He danced with her twice. Just think of that, my dear. He actually danced with her twice, and she was the only creature in the room he asked a second time. First of all, he asked Miss Lucas," she continued breathlessly. "I was so annoyed to see him stand up with her. But he didn't admire her at all, no one can, as you well know. He seemed entirely struck by Jane as she was coming down the dance line, so he inquired who she was, got himself introduced, and claimed her for the next 2 dances. After that, he danced the 3rd set with Miss King, the 4th with Maria Lucas, the 5th with Jane again, the 6th with Lizzie, and then the Boulanger." If he had a shred of compassion for me, Mr. Bennet interrupted impatiently, he wouldn't have danced half as much. For God's sake, say no more about his partners. If only he had sprained his ankle in the first dance. "Oh, my dear," Mrs. Bennet pressed on, undeterred, "I am completely delighted with him. He is so excessively handsome. And his sisters are charming women. I have never in my life seen anything more elegant than their dresses. I dare say the lace on Mrs. Hurst's gown." She was interrupted again. Mr. Bennet lodged a formal protest against any description of women's finery. Forced to find another branch of the subject, she shifted gears and began recounting, with deep bitterness and a fair bit of exaggeration, the shocking rudeness of Mr. Darcy. "But I can assure you," she added, "that Lizzie isn't missing much by not suiting his fancy. He is a terrible, horrid man and not at all worth pleasing. He is so arrogant and so conceited that there was no enduring him. He walked here and he walked there, fancying himself so very great. Not handsome enough to dance with, indeed. I wish you had been there, my dear, to give him one of your set-downs. I quite detest the man." Once Jane and Elizabeth were finally alone, Jane shed the cautious reserve she had maintained all evening. She freely confessed to her sister just how much she admired Mr. Bingley. "He is everything a young man ought to be," Jane said. "Sensible, good-humored, and so lively. I don't think I've ever seen such perfect manners. He is completely at ease, yet entirely well-bred." "He is also handsome," Elizabeth added, "which a young man should always be, if he can manage it. I suppose that makes his character complete. I was so flattered when he asked me for a second dance. I never expected a compliment like that." "Didn't you? I certainly expected it for you. But then, that is the great difference between us, Jane. Compliments always manage to take you by surprise, and they never surprise me. What could be more natural than him asking you again? He couldn't help but notice that you were about 5 times prettier than any other woman in the room. He hardly deserves credit for simple observation." Still, he is very agreeable, and you have my full permission to like him. You have certainly liked far stupider men. Oh, Lizzie. It's true, you are much too eager to like people in general, Elizabeth said. You never see a fault in anyone. To hear you tell it, the whole world is entirely good and completely agreeable. I don't think I have ever heard you speak ill of a single human being. I just don't want to be hasty in judging anyone, Jane said, but I always say what I think. I know you do, and that is exactly what makes it so astonishing. With all your good sense, how can you be so honestly blind to other people's nonsense? It is common enough for people to pretend to be charitable, but to actually be completely sincere without any grandstanding, to take the absolute best parts of a person's character, polish them up, and completely ignore the bad, that is a gift that belongs only to you. So, I suppose you like this man's sisters too, because their manners are certainly not equal to his. Perhaps not at first, Jane admitted, but they are very pleasing women once you actually converse with them. Miss Bingley is going to live with her brother and run his household, and I will be very much mistaken if she doesn't turn out to be a charming neighbor. Elizabeth listened without a word, but she was far from convinced. To her sharper eye, the Bingley sisters' behavior at the assembly had not been designed to win over the general public. Her judgment wasn't swayed by any flattery directed at herself, and her temper wasn't nearly as pliable as Jane's. As a result, she had very little inclination to approve of them. They were, unmistakably, fine ladies. They were perfectly capable of being agreeable when they chose to be, and good-humored when they were entertained, but fundamentally, they were proud and conceited. Beautiful and educated at one of the finest private seminaries in London, they sat on a fortune of £20,000. They were entirely too used to spending money freely and associating with people of high rank. Consequently, they felt fully entitled to think very highly of themselves and rather poorly of everyone else. They came from a respectable family in the north of England, a fact they preferred to remember far more clearly than the inconvenient truth that their brother's fortune, and their own, had been built on trade. Mr. Bingley had inherited nearly £100,000 from his late father. The older man had intended to purchase an estate, but died before he could manage it. Bingley held the same intention, and occasionally went so far as to select a preferred county, but he was currently set up with a fine rented house and the privileges of a manor at Netherfield. Those who understood his easygoing nature suspected he might very well spend the rest of his life right there as a tenant, leaving the actual business of buying an estate to the next generation. His sisters were desperate for him to own property. Still, despite his status as a mere renter, Miss Bingley was more than happy to sit at the head of his table. Her married sister, Mrs. Hurst, whose husband possessed far more fashion than actual money, was equally eager to treat her brother's house as her own whenever it suited her. Bingley had been of age for barely 2 years when a casual recommendation prompted him to look at Netherfield House. He toured the property for half an hour, liked the location, admired the principal rooms, took the owner's word for the rest, and leased it on the spot. Between Bingley and Mr. Darcy, there existed a remarkably steady friendship, despite the stark contrast in their personalities. Darcy was drawn to Bingley's easy, open, and adaptable nature, even though it was the absolute opposite of his own, a disposition Darcy seemed entirely satisfied with. Bingley, in turn, placed the absolute firmest reliance on Darcy's regard and held the highest possible opinion of his judgment. When it came to sheer intellect, Darcy was the superior man. Bingley was certainly not lacking in intelligence, but Darcy was genuinely clever. At the same time, Darcy was haughty, reserved, and fiercely fastidious, possessing manners that, while impeccably well-bred, were utterly uninviting. In this arena, Bingley held the undisputed advantage. Bingley was guaranteed to be liked wherever he went. Darcy was perpetually giving offense. The way the two men spoke of the Meryton Assembly perfectly captured the difference between them. Bingley declared he had never met pleasanter people or prettier girls in his entire life. He felt everyone had been incredibly kind and attentive, completely free of stiffness or formality. He had felt at home with the whole room in moments, and as for Jane Bennet, he couldn't imagine a more beautiful angel. Darcy, on the other hand, had looked out over a crowd utterly lacking in beauty or fashion. He hadn't felt the slightest flicker of interest in anyone, nor had he received any real attention or pleasure from the evening. He conceded that Jane Bennet was pretty, but noted critically that she smiled entirely too much. Mrs. Hurst and her sister agreed with this assessment, but they still admired Jane. They liked her, pronounced her a delightfully sweet girl, and decided they wouldn't mind knowing her better. With Jane officially stamped as a sweet girl by his sisters, Bingley felt perfectly authorized to think of her however he pleased. Chapter V. Just a short walk from Longbourn lived a family who shared a particularly close bond with the Bennets. Sir William Lucas had made a respectable fortune in local Meryton trade before ascending to a knighthood. This honor, granted during his time as mayor after he delivered an address to the king, had gone to his head just enough to make him detest his old business. He had abandoned his commerce and his home in the small market town, moving his family a mile away to a property he promptly christened Lucas Lodge. Free from the burdens of trade, he dedicated his life to feeling important and being unfailingly polite. His elevated rank had not made him a snob. Rather, his presentation at the royal court had left him eager to offer courteous attention to absolutely everyone. He was, by nature, an inoffensive and friendly man. His wife, Lady Lucas, was an amiable woman whose intellect was perfectly average, a quality that made her an ideal companion for Mrs. Bennet. Among their several children, the eldest was Charlotte. At 27, she was a sharp, practical woman and Elizabeth Bennet's closest friend. It was practically a law of nature that the Lucas and Bennet women must convene immediately after a ball to analyze the events. The morning after the Meryton Assembly, the Lucas ladies arrived at Longbourn to trade reports. "You started the evening off wonderfully, Charlotte," Mrs. Bennet said, managing a polite smile. "Mr. Bingley chose you first." "He did," Charlotte agreed, "but he clearly preferred his second partner." "Oh, you mean Jane. Well, he did dance with her twice. It certainly looked as if he was quite taken with her. I heard a rumor, something from Mr. Robinson, though I didn't catch the whole story." "I heard exactly what passed between them," Charlotte said. "Didn't I mention it? Mr. Robinson asked Mr. Bingley how he was enjoying the assembly, whether he thought Meryton had a good share of pretty women, and who he considered the most beautiful. Mr. Bingley didn't even hesitate on that last point. He said, 'The eldest Miss Bennet, without a doubt. There can't be two opinions on the matter.'" "My goodness," Mrs. Bennet exclaimed, "that is a very firm statement. It certainly sounds as if, but of course, you know how these things can amount to nothing." Charlotte turned to Elizabeth. "My eavesdropping turned out much better than yours, Eliza. Mr. Darcy's conversations aren't nearly as pleasant as his friend S, are they? Imagine calling you only just tolerable." "Please don't put it in Lizzie's head to be upset by that man's rudeness," Mrs. Bennet cut in. "He is thoroughly disagreeable. It would be a terrible stroke of bad luck to actually earn his favor. Mrs. Long told me he sat directly beside her for half an hour last night and didn't open his mouth once." "Are you quite sure about that, Mamma?" Jane asked gently. "I thought I saw him speaking to her." "Oh, he eventually did, but only because she finally asked him how he liked Netherfield. He couldn't avoid answering her then. But she said he looked absolutely furious that she had dared to speak to him. Miss Bingley mentioned to me," Jane offered, "that he rarely speaks much in large crowds. She says he is remarkably charming among his close friends." "I don't believe a word of it," Mrs. Bennet declared. "If he were so agreeable, he would have made polite conversation with Mrs. Long. But I know exactly what happened. Everyone says he is practically eaten alive by his own pride. I bet he found out she doesn't own a carriage and had to rent a hack chaise to get to the ball." "I don't particularly care if he ignores Mrs. Long," Charlotte said, "but I do wish he had danced with Eliza." "If I were you, Lizzie," her mother said, "I would refuse to dance with him if he ever asked." Elizabeth smiled. "I think I can safely promise you, Mamma, that I will never dance with him." "His arrogance doesn't bother me as much as most people's," Charlotte reasoned, "because there is some justification for it. You can hardly be surprised when a handsome young man with wealth, a great family, and every possible advantage thinks highly of himself. If I can put it this way, he has earned the right to be proud." "That is a fair point," Elizabeth replied, "and I could easily forgive his pride if only he hadn't mortified mine." Mary, who prided herself on being the deep thinker of the family, cleared her throat to share her reflections. "Pride, I believe, is a remarkably common flaw. From everything I have read, human nature is particularly susceptible to it. Very few of us are completely free of some secret self-satisfaction regarding our own traits, whether those traits are real or entirely imagined. We often use the words interchangeably, but vanity and pride are distinct concepts. A person can be proud without being vain. Pride relates to our internal estimation of ourselves, whereas vanity is an obsession with what we want other people to think of us. Before anyone could digest Mary's lecture, one of the younger Lucas boys, who had tagged along with his sisters, chimed in. "If I were as rich as Mr. Darcy, I wouldn't care how proud I was. I would keep a whole pack of foxhounds and drink a bottle of wine every single day." "Then you would be drinking far more than you ought to," Mrs. Bennet scolded. "If I ever caught you at it, I'd take the bottle right out of your hands." The boy hotly protested that she wouldn't dare. Mrs. Bennet loudly insisted that she would, and their bickering carried on until the end of the visit. The women of Longbourn soon paid their required call to the ladies of Netherfield, and the visit was properly returned. Jane Bennet's gentle charm steadily won the approval of Mr. Bingley's sisters, Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. They made no secret, however, of their distaste for the rest of the Bennet family, finding the mother unbearable and the younger sisters completely beneath notice. Only Jane and Elizabeth were deemed worthy of further acquaintance. Jane was delighted by their attention. Elizabeth, however, remained skeptical. She saw the sisters' deep-seated arrogance in how they treated everyone else. She couldn't bring herself to like them, even if their sudden fondness for Jane likely stemmed from their brother's obvious infatuation. Every time the two families mingled, Mr. Bingley's admiration for Jane was impossible to miss. Elizabeth could clearly see that Jane was quietly falling in love with him, too. But Jane was naturally serene, her deep feelings masked by a cheerful, unwavering composure. Elizabeth felt relieved. Jane's steady temper would protect her from the gossip of nosy neighbors. She shared this comforting thought with her close friend, Charlotte Lucas. "It might be nice to fool the gossips," Charlotte pointed out, "but playing it so safe can backfire. If a woman hides her feelings too well from the man she wants, she might lose him entirely. It's small comfort to know the rest of the world was fooled too. There's so much vanity and gratitude tangled up in falling in love that you can't just leave it to chance. A little initial attraction is natural, but very few men have the courage to fall deeply in love without a push. 9 times out of 10, a woman should show more affection than she actually feels. Bingley clearly likes Jane, but he might never do more than like her if she doesn't encourage him." "She does encourage him," Elizabeth argued, "as much as her personality allows. If I can see she's falling for him, he'd have to be an idiot to miss it." "Remember, Eliza, he doesn't know her the way you do." "But if a woman genuinely likes a man and isn't trying to hide it, he's bound to figure it out." "Maybe, if he spends enough time with her," Charlotte said. "They see each other often enough, but it's always in large crowds. They aren't spending hours deep in conversation. Jane needs to maximize every single minute she has his attention. Once she actually has a ring on her finger, she'll have the rest of her life to fall in love as much as she wants." "That's a great strategy if your only goal is to bag a rich husband," Elizabeth said with a laugh. "And if I were desperate to marry, I might try it. But Jane isn't scheming. She doesn't even know how she truly feels yet or if those feelings are justified. She's only known him for 2 weeks. 4 dances, 1 morning visit, and 4 group dinners. That's hardly enough time to understand a man's true character." "It depends on how you look at it. If they had merely eaten dinner together, she might only know if he had a good appetite. But 4 entire evenings can reveal a great deal." "Oh, certainly. They've discovered they both prefer playing Vington over commerce. Aside from their taste in card games, I doubt they've uncovered much else." "Well," Charlotte said, "I wish her the best. But if she married him tomorrow, she'd have just as good a chance at happiness as if she spent a year studying his flaws. Marital happiness is entirely a game of chance. Knowing someone perfectly beforehand doesn't guarantee a thing. People always change enough after the wedding to cause plenty of grief. It's much better to know as little as possible about the faults of the person you're going to spend your life with." "You're trying to make me laugh, Charlotte, but that's nonsense. You know it's nonsense, and you'd never actually live by it." While Elizabeth was busy watching Mr. Bingley dote on her sister, she had no idea she was becoming the focus of Bingley's best friend. At first, Mr. Darcy had barely considered Elizabeth Bennet passable. He hadn't given her a second glance at the Meryton Assembly, and during their next few meetings, he had looked at her only to find fault. But just as he had comfortably convinced himself, and his friends, that she didn't have a single truly beautiful feature on her face, he realized her expression was illuminated by the striking intelligence of her dark eyes. This frustrating discovery was soon followed by others. Despite his critical eye catching several flaws in her symmetry, he had to admit her figure was light and graceful. And though he insisted her manners lacked high society polish, he found himself unexpectedly captivated by her easy, playful energy. Elizabeth was entirely oblivious. As far as she was concerned, Darcy was simply an unpleasant man who refused to be agreeable and who hadn't found her attractive enough to dance with. Darcy wanted to learn more about her. As a first step, he began hovering nearby, listening in on her conversations with other people. Elizabeth finally caught him doing it during a large gathering at Sir William Lucas's house. "What on earth is Mr. Darcy up to?" she asked Charlotte. "He's been eavesdropping on my conversation with Colonel Forster." Only Mr. Darcy could answer that. "If he keeps it up, I'm going to let him know I've caught him. He has such a critical eye. If I don't go on the offensive and tease him a little, I'll end up being intimidated by him." When Darcy drifted over to them a moment later, looking as though he had no intention of actually speaking, Charlotte dared Elizabeth to follow through on her threat. Rising to the challenge, Elizabeth turned to him. "Don't you agree, Mr. Darcy, that I made an incredibly persuasive argument just now, begging Colonel Forster to host a ball in Meryton?" "You spoke with great energy," Darcy replied, "but the subject of dancing always makes a lady energetic." "You are too hard on us." Charlotte interrupted. "It's your turn to be teased, Eliza. I'm going to open the piano, and you know what that means." "You are a terrible friend," Elizabeth said. "You always demand I play and sing in front of absolutely everyone. If I were desperately vain about my music, you'd be a treasure. But as it is, I'd much rather not perform for people who are used to hearing the very best musicians." When Charlotte insisted, Elizabeth gave in. "Fine, if you demand it." She shot a grave look toward Mr. Darcy. "There is an old saying everyone knows, keep your breath to cool your porridge. I suppose I shall keep mine to swell my song." Her performance was charming, though far from masterful. After she sang a song or two, several people begged for another, but her younger sister Mary eagerly took her place at the piano. As the only plain girl in the Bennet family, Mary had worked tirelessly to master complex music and dense books, and she was always desperate to show off. Unfortunately, Mary lacked both natural talent and true artistic taste. Her vanity had driven her to practice, but it also made her pedantic and conceited, traits that ruined whatever technical skill she had achieved. Elizabeth, relaxed and genuine, had been a pleasure to listen to, even though she wasn't half the musician Mary was. After dragging out a lengthy, tedious concerto, Mary finally managed to buy back the room's gratitude by playing a series of upbeat Scottish and Irish folk songs. Her younger sisters, along with a few of the Lucas girls and several military officers, immediately started dancing at the back of the room. Mr. Darcy stood nearby, silently appalled by this provincial way of spending an evening, all this jumping about with no proper conversation. He was so lost in his own brooding that he didn't realize Sir William Lucas had sidled up beside him. "What a wonderful amusement for the youth, Mr. Darcy," Sir William began. "There really is nothing quite like dancing. I consider it one of the absolute pinnacles of a highly polished society." "Undoubtedly, sir," Darcy said, "and it also has the distinct advantage of being popular among the least polished societies on earth. Every savage can dance." Sir William only smiled at this. "Your friend Mr. Bingley dances delightfully," he added, watching Bingley join the group. "And I have no doubt you are quite an expert yourself, Mr. Darcy." "You saw me dance at the Meryton Assembly, I believe, sir." "I did indeed, and it was a great pleasure to watch. Do you often dance at the Royal Court in St. James's?" "Never, sir." "Don't you think it would be a fitting compliment to the venue?" "It is a compliment I refuse to pay to any venue, if I can possibly avoid it." "You have a townhouse in London, I assume?" Mr. Darcy gave a stiff bow. "I considered settling in town myself once," Sir William mused, "as I am quite fond of elite society. But I wasn't entirely sure the London air would suit Lady Lucas." He paused, clearly waiting for Darcy to contribute to the conversation. Darcy remained entirely silent. Just then, Elizabeth happened to walk past them. Struck by the urge to play the gallant host, Sir William called out to her. "My dear Miss Eliza, why aren't you dancing? Mr. Darcy, please allow me to present this lovely young lady as a highly desirable partner. I'm sure you cannot refuse to dance when such beauty is standing right in front of you." Sir William reached out, took Elizabeth's hand, and attempted to place it into Darcy's. Darcy, though completely caught off guard, was actually perfectly willing to take it. But Elizabeth instantly snatched her hand back. "Indeed, sir, I have absolutely no intention of dancing," she told Sir William, her composure slipping into flustered annoyance. "Please don't think I walked over here to beg for a partner." Mr. Darcy, recovering his grave manners, formally requested the honor of her hand. It was no use. Elizabeth's mind was made up. Sir William tried to persuade her. "You are such an excellent dancer, Miss Eliza. It is cruel to deny me the joy of watching you. Even though this gentleman generally dislikes the activity, I'm sure he would have no objection to obliging us for just half an hour." "Mr. Darcy is all politeness," Elizabeth said with a tight smile. "He certainly is, but considering the prize, my dear Miss Eliza, we can hardly be surprised by his willingness. Who could possibly object to such a partner?" Elizabeth gave a sharp, knowing look and walked away. Her bold rejection hadn't offended Darcy in the least. In fact, he was standing there thinking of her with distinct admiration when Miss Bingley walked up and interrupted him. "I can guess what you're daydreaming about," she said. "I highly doubt it. You're thinking about how unbearable it would be to spend many more evenings this way, trapped in this kind of society. I completely agree with you. I have never been more irritated in my life. These people are so boring, yet so incredibly loud. They are total nobodies, yet they have such inflated egos. Oh, what I wouldn't give to hear you completely tear them apart." "Your guess is entirely wrong, I assure you," Darcy said. "My mind was occupied by something far more pleasant. I was just meditating on the incredible pleasure that a pair of beautiful eyes in the face of a pretty woman can provide." Miss Bingley stared at him, her own eyes fixed sharply on his face. She demanded to know exactly which lady had inspired such a thought. Darcy answered without hesitation, "Miss Elizabeth Bennet." "Miss Elizabeth Bennet," Miss Bingley echoed. "I am absolutely stunned. Since when is she such a favorite of yours? And please tell me, when exactly should I wish you joy on your marriage?" "That is exactly the question I expected you to ask," Darcy said. "A lady's imagination moves so quickly. It jumps from basic admiration to deep love, and from love right to the wedding altar in the blink of an eye. I knew you would already be wishing me joy." "Well, if you are truly serious about her, I suppose we must consider it a done deal," she sneered. "You'll have a truly delightful mother-in-law, won't you? And naturally, she will be practically living with you at Pemberley." Darcy listened with total indifference as she amused herself with insults. Seeing that he wasn't bothered in the slightest, she assumed the threat was completely imagined, and her sharp wit flowed freely for the rest of the evening. Mr. Bennet's estate brought in £2,000 a year, but unfortunately for his 5 daughters, the property was strictly entailed to a distant male relative. Mrs. Bennet's own fortune, £4,000 inherited from her father, a Meryton attorney, was respectable enough for her station in life, but hardly sufficient to offset the severe limits of her husband's wealth. She also had 2 siblings, a brother running a successful business in London, and a sister married to Mr. Phillips, who had inherited her father's law practice. Meryton was a mere mile from Longbourn, making it an easy and tempting stroll for the Bennet girls. They walked over at least 3 or 4 times a week, ostensibly to pay their respects to their aunt and to browse the milliner's shop across the street. Catherine and Lydia, the 2 youngest, made the trip most often. With little else occupying their minds, a morning walk into town was their primary source of entertainment, providing just enough gossip to furnish conversation for the evening. And no matter how dull the countryside might be, they could always rely on their aunt for a fresh rumor. Currently, the village was overflowing with both news and excitement. A militia regiment had established its winter headquarters in Meryton. Suddenly, Aunt Phillip's house became an invaluable fountain of intelligence. Every day, the girls learned more about the officers' names and family connections. Their lodgings were soon discovered, and eventually, the girls were introduced to the men themselves. To Catherine and Lydia, a military uniform was the pinnacle of human achievement. Mr. Bingley's vast wealth, which so thrilled their mother, paled in comparison to a simple ensign's regimentals. After suffering through an entire morning of their swooning on the subject, Mr. Bennet offered a dry assessment. "From everything I can gather by the way you 2 talk," he said calmly, "you must be the silliest girls in the entire country. I have suspected it for a while, but now I am absolutely convinced." Catherine fell silent, visibly ruffled. Lydia, completely unfazed, simply went on talking about how much she admired Captain Carter and how she hoped to see him that very day before he left for London. "My dear," Mrs. Bennet said, aghast, "how can you be so quick to call your own children silly? If I wanted to insult anyone's daughters, it certainly wouldn't be my own. If my children are foolish, I prefer to be aware of it. Yes, but as it happens, they are all incredibly clever." "Then this is the one point where we disagree," Mr. Bennet replied. "I always hoped our sentiments were perfectly aligned, but I must confess I find our two youngest daughters to be uncommonly foolish." "Oh, Mr. Bennet, you can't expect young girls to have the same sense as their parents. By the time they reach our age, they won't care about officers any more than we do. I remember when I was quite fond of a red coat myself, and honestly, in my heart, I still am. If a handsome young colonel with 5,000 or 6,000 a year wanted to marry one of my girls, I certainly wouldn't turn him away. I thought Colonel Forster looked exceedingly handsome in his regimentals at Sir William's the other night." "Mamma," Lydia interrupted, "Aunt Phillips says Colonel Forster and Captain Carter hardly ever go to Miss Watson's house anymore. She sees them standing around in Clark's library all the time now." A footman's entrance cut her off. He carried a note from Netherfield for Jane and waited for a reply. Mrs. Bennet's eyes lit up with anticipation. "Well, Jane," she pressed as her daughter broke the seal, "who is it from? What does it say? Hurry up and tell us, my love." "It is from Miss Bingley," Jane said, and read it aloud. "My dear friend Asterisk, if you do not take pity on Louisa and me and join us for dinner today, we are in severe danger of loathing one another for the rest of our lives. Two women left to their own devices for a whole day will inevitably end up quarreling. Please come the moment you receive this. My brother and the other gentlemen are dining out with the military officers. Yours ever, Caroline Bingley." "With the officers?" Lydia cried. "Why didn't Aunt Phillips tell us about that?" "Dining out," Mrs. Bennet muttered. "Well, that is very unlucky." "May I take the carriage?" Jane asked. "No, my dear, you had better ride on horseback. It looks as though it might rain, and if it does, they will simply have to insist you stay the night." "That would be a brilliant plan," Elizabeth pointed out, "if you could be absolutely sure they wouldn't just send her home in their own carriage." "Nonsense. The gentlemen will need Mr. Bingley's chaise to go to Meryton, and the Hursts don't have horses for theirs." "I really would prefer the coach," Jane pleaded. "My dear, your father cannot spare the horses," Mrs. Bennet insisted. "They are needed on the farm, aren't they, Mr. Bennet?" "They are needed on the farm far more often than I can actually get them," he replied. "But if you have them today," Elizabeth said, "then my mother's plan will work perfectly." After a bit more prodding, Mr. Bennet finally confirmed that the horses were indeed busy elsewhere. Jane was forced to saddle up, and her mother followed her out to the door, happily predicting a terrible storm. Mrs. Bennet's wishes were soon granted. Jane had barely ridden out of sight before a heavy rain began to fall. While her sisters worried about her getting drenched, Mrs. Bennet was absolutely thrilled. The downpour lasted all evening without a single break. There was no way Jane could ride home. "What a stroke of luck. That was my idea, you know," Mrs. Bennet repeated endlessly, acting as if she had personally summoned the storm clouds. But she didn't realize just how successful her scheme had been until the following morning. Breakfast had barely finished when a Netherfield servant arrived with a letter for Elizabeth. "My dearest Lizzie, asterisk. I feel very unwell this morning, likely because I was soaked through yesterday. My kind hosts absolutely refuse to let me travel until I am fully recovered. They are even insisting on calling Mr. Jones, so please don't worry if you hear the apothecary has been here. Aside from a sore throat and a headache, I am perfectly fine. Yours, etc." "Well, my dear," Mr. Bennet said after Elizabeth read the note to the room, "if your daughter were to contract a fatal illness and pass away, it would certainly be a great comfort to know she perished in pursuit of Mr. Bingley, entirely by your command." "Oh, I am not worried about her dying. People do not die of little everyday colds. They will take excellent care of her. As long as she stays at Netherfield, everything is working out perfectly. I would go check on her myself if I could just get the carriage." Elizabeth, however, was genuinely anxious. She decided she had to see Jane immediately, even without a carriage. Since she didn't know how to ride a horse, walking was her only option. She announced her plan to the room. "How can you be so foolish?" her mother cried. "Just look at the mud. You won't be fit to be seen by the time you arrive." I shall be fit to see Jane, and that is all I care about. Is this your subtle way of asking me to send for the horses, Lizzie? Her father asked. Not at all, I don't mind the walk. 3 miles is nothing when you have a real motive to go. I will be back by dinner. Mary looked up from her reading. I admire your active benevolence, Elizabeth, but every emotional impulse ought to be governed by reason. In my view, physical exertion should always match the actual necessity. We'll walk with you as far as Meryton, Catherine and Lydia volunteered. The three sisters set out together. If we hurry, Lydia said as they marched along the road, we might catch a glimpse of Captain Carter before he leaves. In Meryton, they split up. The two youngest headed straight for the lodgings of an officer's wife, while Elizabeth forged on alone. She crossed field after field at a brisk, determined pace, vaulting over wooden stiles and leaping across muddy puddles. By the time Netherfield Park came into view, her ankles were aching, her stockings were spattered with mud, and her face was flushed with the heat of the exercise. A servant led her into the breakfast parlor, where everyone except Jane was gathered. Elizabeth's entrance caused an immediate stir. That a young woman would trek 3 miles through the mud, early in the morning, and completely unchaperoned, seemed almost scandalous to Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley. Elizabeth could see the contempt in their eyes. Still, they welcomed her with polite formality. Their brother, however, was far more than polite. Mr. Bingley was genuinely warm and kind. Mr. Darcy said very little, and Mr. Hurst said nothing at all. Mr. Hurst was entirely focused on his breakfast. Mr. Darcy, meanwhile, was deeply conflicted. He couldn't help admiring the brilliant color the brisk walk had brought to Elizabeth's complexion, even as he questioned the propriety of her traveling so far alone. When Elizabeth asked after her sister, the answers were discouraging. Jane had slept poorly and was running a fever, leaving her too ill to leave her room. Elizabeth was relieved to be taken upstairs immediately. Jane was overjoyed to see her. She had desperately wanted to ask Elizabeth to come in her note, but hadn't wanted to cause any alarm or inconvenience. Still, Jane was too weak for much conversation. When Miss Bingley finally left the room, Jane could do little more than whisper her gratitude for the extraordinary kindness her hosts had shown her. Elizabeth simply sat beside the bed, tending to her in silence. After breakfast, the Bingley sisters came upstairs to join them. Seeing their genuine affection and concern for Jane actually softened Elizabeth's opinion of them. Soon, Mr. Jones the apothecary arrived. After examining his patient, he confirmed the obvious. Jane had caught a violent cold and needed immediate rest to fight it off. He ordered her to stay in bed and promised to send over some soothing draughts. Jane followed his advice without argument, as her fever was rising and her head was throbbing. Elizabeth refused to leave the room for even a moment. The Bingley women stayed close by as well. With the men out of the house, they had nothing else to occupy their time. When the clock struck 3, Elizabeth knew she had to leave. She announced her departure with heavy reluctance. Miss Bingley immediately offered her the use of the carriage. Elizabeth only needed a little persuading to accept, but Jane looked so deeply distressed at the thought of parting that Miss Bingley gracefully changed her offer. Instead of a carriage ride home, she invited Elizabeth to remain at Netherfield for the time being. Elizabeth accepted with immense relief. A servant was quickly dispatched to Longbourn to inform the Bennet family of her stay and to bring back a fresh supply of clothes. At 5 o'clock, the two Bingley sisters retreated to dress for the evening, leaving Elizabeth to attend to Jane until 6:30, when she was called down to dinner. The moment she entered the dining room, a chorus of polite inquiries washed over her. Elizabeth could clearly distinguish Mr. Bingley's genuine concern from the empty manners of the rest, but she had no good news to share. Jane was no better. Upon hearing this, Bingley's sisters repeated 3 or 4 times how deeply grieved they were, how dreadful it was to suffer a bad cold, and how intensely they despised being ill themselves. Having fulfilled their social duty, they banished the matter from their minds. The moment Jane was no longer the immediate topic of conversation, their complete indifference returned, restoring Elizabeth to her original, thorough dislike of them. Indeed, their brother was the only person in the room Elizabeth could look upon with any warmth. His anxiety for Jane was obvious, and his polite attentions to Elizabeth were a great comfort, keeping her from feeling quite as much of an intruder as she knew the others considered her. She received almost no notice from anyone else. Miss Bingley was entirely absorbed in charming Mr. Darcy, and Mrs. Hurst was hardly less focused on him. As for Mr. Hurst, who sat beside Elizabeth, He was a sluggish man who lived only to eat, drink, and play cards. When he discovered that Elizabeth preferred a simple dish to a heavy French ragout, he decided she wasn't worth speaking to. Once dinner concluded, Elizabeth hurried straight back upstairs to her sister. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, Miss Bingley launched into a merciless critique. Elizabeth's manners, Miss Bingley declared, were absolutely dreadful, a terrible mix of arrogance and disrespect. She had no conversation, no style, no taste, and no beauty. Mrs. Hurst quickly agreed. In short, she has nothing to recommend her except being an excellent walker. I will never forget how she looked this morning. She seemed practically feral. She certainly did, Louisa. I could barely keep a straight face. It was completely absurd for her to come at all. Why on earth must she go scampering across the countryside just because her sister has a cold? Her hair was a disaster, so messy and windswept. Yes, and her petticoat, Mrs. Hurst added. I hope you noticed her petticoat. It was caked in 6 inches of solid mud, I am absolutely certain of it. And she had let down her outer gown to hide it, which did no good at all. Your description might be perfectly accurate, Louisa, Bingley said, but I didn't notice a thing. I thought Miss Elizabeth Bennet looked remarkably well when she walked into the room this morning. Her dirty petticoat completely escaped my attention. I am quite sure you noticed it, Mr. Darcy, Miss Bingley said, turning her attention back to her target. And I am inclined to think you would never wish to see your own sister make such a spectacle of herself. Certainly not, Darcy replied. To walk 3, 4, or 5 miles, whatever it was, up to her ankles in mud and all by herself. What could she possibly mean by it? To me, it shows an awful kind of conceited independence. A completely vulgar, country-town indifference to proper decorum. It shows a very deep affection for her sister, Bingley said, which is entirely to her credit. Miss Bingley leaned in, dropping her voice to a half-whisper. I am afraid, Mr. Darcy, that this little adventure has rather dampened your admiration of her fine eyes. Not at all, Darcy said quietly. They were brightened by the exercise. A brief silence followed this exchange, until Mrs. Hurst started up again. I have an enormous amount of affection for Jane Bennet, she sighed. She really is a very sweet girl, and I wish with all my heart that she could be well married. But with parents like hers, and such incredibly low-class connections, I am afraid she has no chance of it. I believe I heard you say that their uncle is a local attorney in Meryton, Miss Bingley asked. Yes, and they have another uncle who lives somewhere in Cheapside, right in the city. That is simply priceless, Miss Bingley said, and the two sisters laughed heartily at the thought of a relative working in London's merchant district. If they had enough uncles to fill all of Cheapside, Bingley snapped, it would not make them 1 ounce less agreeable. Perhaps, Darcy replied, but it must very materially lessen their chances of marrying men of any real standing in the world. Bingley didn't answer, but his sisters voiced their enthusiastic agreement with Darcy. They spent the next few minutes thoroughly enjoying themselves at the expense of their dear friend's vulgar family. Despite their mockery, the sisters managed to summon a renewed wave of superficial tenderness after leaving the dining room. They went up to Jane's room and sat with her until they were called down for coffee. Jane was still feeling very poorly. Elizabeth refused to leave her bedside until late in the evening, when she finally had the comfort of seeing her sister fall asleep. Realizing she should probably make an appearance, Elizabeth headed downstairs. Entering the drawing room, she found the entire party gathered around a table, playing loo. They immediately invited her to join the card game, but, suspecting they were gambling for high stakes, Elizabeth politely declined. Using her sister as an excuse, she said she would only stay down for a short while and would entertain herself with a book. Mr. Hurst stared at her in utter bewilderment. You prefer reading to playing cards? That is rather odd. Miss Eliza Bennet despises cards, Miss Bingley chimed in. She is a great reader and finds no pleasure in anything else. I deserve neither that praise nor that criticism, Elizabeth said. I am not a great reader, and I find pleasure in a great many things. I am sure you find pleasure in nursing your sister, Bingley said kindly, and I hope that pleasure will soon be increased by seeing her completely recovered. Elizabeth thanked him warmly, then crossed the room to a side table where a few books were stacked. Bingley immediately jumped up, offering to fetch her others, anything his library held. I only wish my collection were larger, both for your sake and for my own pride, Bingley said with a self-deprecating smile. But I am a lazy fellow. Though my library is small, I still own more books than I have ever bothered to open. Elizabeth assured him that the books already in the room would suit her perfectly. I am honestly surprised, Miss Bingley remarked, that your father left you such a small collection, Charles. What a magnificent library you have at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy. It ought to be good, Darcy replied. It represents the work of many generations. And you have added so much to it yourself. You are always buying books. I cannot understand neglecting a family library in times like these, Darcy said. Neglect? I am sure you neglect nothing that could possibly enhance that beautiful estate. Charles, when you eventually build your own house, I can only hope it will be half as wonderful as Pemberley. I hope so too, Bingley said. But I would really advise you to buy land in that same neighborhood, Charles, and just use Pemberley as your model. There is not a finer county in all of England than Derbyshire. With all my heart, Bingley laughed. I will gladly buy Pemberley itself if Darcy is willing to sell it. I am speaking of realistic possibilities, Charles. Upon my word, Caroline, I think it would be more realistic to buy Pemberley outright than to try and imitate it. Elizabeth was so intrigued by the conversation that she could barely focus on her reading. Soon, she abandoned the book entirely. She moved closer to the card table, taking a seat between Mr. Bingley and his eldest sister to watch the game. Has Miss Darcy grown much since the spring? Miss Bingley asked. Will she be as tall as I am? I believe she will, Darcy said. She is currently about Miss Elizabeth Bennet's height, or perhaps a bit taller. How I long to see her again. I have never met anyone who delighted me so much. Such a beautiful face, such elegant manners, and so incredibly accomplished for someone her age. Her skill on the piano is simply exquisite. It genuinely amazes me, Bingley said, shaking his head, how young ladies have the patience to become as exceptionally accomplished as they all are. All young ladies accomplished? My dear Charles, whatever do you mean? I mean all of them. They all paint little tables, cover decorative screens, and knit silk purses. I hardly know a single woman who cannot do all of that. I don't think I have ever heard a young lady introduced for the first time without someone immediately informing me that she is very accomplished. Your description of what commonly passes for accomplishments has a great deal of truth to it, Darcy said. The word is thrown at any woman who can knit a purse or paint a screen. But I cannot agree with your high estimation of ladies in general. Out of my entire acquaintance, I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen women who are truly accomplished. Nor can I am sure, Miss Bingley added quickly. Then Elizabeth said, your definition of an accomplished woman must encompass a great deal. Yes, Darcy said, it encompasses a great deal. Oh, absolutely, Miss Bingley interjected, eager to assist him. No one can be considered truly accomplished unless she vastly surpasses the ordinary. A woman must have a comprehensive knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and modern languages to even deserve the word. And on top of all that, she must possess a certain undefinable quality in her posture, her manner of walking, the tone of her voice, and her style of speaking. Otherwise, she only half deserves the title. She must possess all of this, Darcy added, and to all of this she must add something far more substantial: the continuous improvement of her mind through extensive reading. Elizabeth smiled. I am no longer surprised that you only know 6 accomplished women. I am only surprised that you know any. Are you so severe on your own sex that you doubt such a woman could exist? Darcy asked. I have certainly never seen one. I have never seen such capacity, taste, dedication, and elegance united in a single person. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley immediately cried out against the terrible injustice of Elizabeth's skepticism. They loudly protested that they knew dozens of women who fit that exact description, keeping up the noise until Mr. Hurst demanded they stop talking and pay attention to the cards. With the conversation firmly shut down, Elizabeth soon excused herself and went back upstairs. The moment the door clicked shut behind her, Miss Bingley sighed. Eliza Bennet is one of those young ladies who tries to make herself look better to men by tearing down other women. I suppose it works with some men, but in my opinion, it is a cheap trick. A very nasty little tactic. Undoubtedly, Darcy replied, as the remark had been aimed squarely at him. There is a certain ugliness in all the cunning tricks women sometimes stoop to in order to captivate a man. Anything that even borders on manipulation is despicable. Miss Bingley was not entirely thrilled with this response, and she smartly decided to drop the subject. Elizabeth came back downstairs a short time later, only to report that her sister had taken a turn for the worse, and she could not leave her side. Bingley immediately wanted to send for the local apothecary, Mr. Jones. His sisters, convinced that rural doctors were useless, argued that they should send an express rider to London for a top-tier physician. Elizabeth absolutely refused the London doctor, but she was willing to agree to Bingley's suggestion. They settled the matter. If Jane was not clearly better by morning, they would send for Mr. Jones at first light. Bingley was visibly upset by the news. His sisters declared themselves completely miserable. They then proceeded to comfort themselves by singing cheerful duets in the parlor after supper, while their brother found his only relief in giving strict orders to the housekeeper to ensure the sick ladies upstairs received every possible comfort. Elizabeth spent the better part of the night by her sister's bedside. By morning, Jane was doing well enough that Elizabeth could send a fairly positive report to Mr. Bingley, who had dispatched a housemaid at dawn to check on them. A short while later, the elegant ladies' maids belonging to Bingley's sisters came to the door with similar inquiries. Despite Jane's slight improvement, Elizabeth thought it best to send a note to Longbourn, asking her mother to come and evaluate Jane's condition for herself. The message was dispatched at once, and the response was just as swift. Mrs. Bennet, bringing her two youngest daughters along, arrived at Netherfield shortly after the household had finished breakfast. Had Jane been in any real danger, Mrs. Bennet would have been beside herself with worry. But once she saw that the illness was not life-threatening, she lost any desire for a rapid recovery. Good health would mean Jane had to leave Netherfield. Consequently, she firmly rejected Jane's request to be taken home, and the local apothecary, arriving around the same time, also advised against moving her. After Mrs. Bennet had sat with her eldest daughter for a little while, Miss Bingley appeared and invited the mother and her three daughters to join the rest of the party downstairs. Bingley met them in the breakfast parlor, expressing his earnest hope that Mrs. Bennet had not found Jane in a worse state than she had expected. "Oh, indeed I have, sir," she told him. "She is much too ill to be moved anywhere. Mr. Jones says it is entirely out of the question. I am afraid we must trespass on your kindness just a little longer." "Moved," Bingley exclaimed. "It cannot even be considered. My sister, I am certain, would not hear of it." "You may be assured, madam," Miss Bingley added, her politeness perfectly chilling, "that Miss Bennet will receive every possible attention for as long as she remains with us." Mrs. Bennet overwhelmed them with gratitude. "If it were not for such good friends," she rattled on, "I simply do not know what would become of my poor Jane. She is very ill and in so much pain, but she bears it with the greatest patience in the world. But then, she always does. She has the sweetest temper of anyone I have ever known. I often tell my other girls they cannot hold a candle to her. You have a lovely room here, Mr. Bingley, and a charming view down that gravel walk. I do not know a single place in the country that can rival Netherfield. I certainly hope you are not thinking of leaving it any time soon, even if you are only on a short lease." "Whatever I do in a hurry," Bingley replied with a smile. "So, if I ever do decide to leave Netherfield, I will probably be gone in 5 minutes. For the time being, however, I consider myself quite firmly settled." "That is exactly what I would have guessed about you," Elizabeth said. Bingley turned toward her. "You are beginning to understand me, are you?" "Oh yes, I understand you perfectly." "I wish I could take that as a compliment," he said, "but to be so easily read is rather pitiful, I am afraid." "That depends," Elizabeth countered. "A deep, complex character is not automatically more valuable than an open one like yours." "Lizzie," her mother snapped, "remember where you are. You must not rattle on in that wild way of yours as if you were at home." Bingley, however, immediately resumed the thread. "I had no idea you were a student of character, Miss Bennet. It must be a fascinating study." "It is," Elizabeth said, "but the complicated characters are the most entertaining. That, at least, is their advantage." "The country," Darcy remarked, speaking up for the first time, "can offer very few subjects for that kind of study. In a country neighborhood, you move in a very confined and unvarying society." "But people themselves change so much," Elizabeth pointed out, "that there is always something new to observe in them." "Yes, indeed," Mrs. Bennet cried, visibly bristling at Darcy's dismissal of rural society. "I assure you, sir, there is just as much going on in the country as there is in town." A stunned silence fell over the room. Darcy stared at her for a long moment, then silently turned his back. Convinced she had achieved a total victory over him, Mrs. Bennet pressed her advantage. For my part, I cannot see that London has any great advantage over the country at all, except perhaps for the shops and the public venues. The country is vastly more pleasant. Isn't it, Mr. Bingley? When I am in the country, Bingley replied diplomatically, I never want to leave, and when I am in town, I feel exactly the same. They both have their advantages, and I can be perfectly happy in either. Ah, well, that is because you have a proper disposition, she said. But that gentleman, she added, glaring at the back of Darcy's head, seems to think the country is nothing at all. Mamma, you are mistaken, Elizabeth said, her cheeks burning. You misunderstood Mr. Darcy. He only meant that you do not meet as wide a variety of people in the country as you do in the city, which you must admit is true. Well, certainly, my dear, no one claimed there were. But as for not meeting many people around here, I do not know of many larger neighborhoods. Why, we regularly dine with 24 families. Only his deep sympathy for Elizabeth kept Bingley from laughing out loud. His sister had no such tact. She shot Mr. Darcy a heavily expressive, mocking smile. Desperate to direct her mother's thoughts elsewhere, Elizabeth quickly asked if Charlotte Lucas had been by Longbourn since she left. Yes, she called yesterday with her father, Mrs. Bennet said. What a deeply agreeable man Sir William is, Mr. Bingley, don't you think? Such a man of the world. So polished, yet so easy to talk to. He always has something to say to absolutely everyone. That is my definition of good breeding. These people who fancy themselves too important to open their mouths are quite mistaken. Did Charlotte stay for dinner? Elizabeth asked. No, she had to get home. She was needed in the kitchen for the mince pies, I imagine. For my part, Mr. Bingley, I only keep servants who can do their own work. My daughters are brought up differently. But to each their own, and the Lucases are a very good sort of girls, I assure you. It is just a pity they are not handsome. Not that I think Charlotte is terribly plain, but she is, of course, our particular friend. She seems like a very pleasant young woman, Bingley offered. Oh, certainly, but you must admit she is very plain. Lady Lucas herself has admitted as much, and she has always envied me for Jane's beauty. I hate to boast about my own child, but truly, you do not often see anyone as lovely as Jane. That is what everyone says. It is not just a mother's bias. When she was only 15, there was a gentleman visiting my brother Gardiner in town who was so deeply in love with her that my sister-in-law was certain he would propose before we left. He did not, in the end. Perhaps he thought her too young. He did write some verses for her, however, and they were very pretty. And that was the end of his affection, Elizabeth said, with a sigh of impatience. I imagine a great many romances have been killed off in exactly that way. I wonder who first discovered that poetry was the most effective way to drive away love. I have always been taught to consider poetry the food of love, Darcy said. It might be, if it is a fine, robust, healthy love, Elizabeth countered. Everything nourishes a fire that is already burning brightly, but if it is only a slight, fragile sort of inclination, I am convinced that one good sonnet will starve it out entirely. Darcy offered only a faint smile. In the heavy pause that followed, Elizabeth sat in terror, waiting for her mother to embarrass herself again. She desperately wanted to speak, but her mind was utterly blank. After a short silence, Mrs. Bennet broke the quiet by loudly repeating her gratitude to Bingley for housing Jane, followed by an elaborate apology for forcing him to put up with Elizabeth as well. Bingley replied with genuine, unaffected warmth. He even managed to compel his younger sister into offering the polite parting words the situation required, which Miss Bingley delivered with very little grace. Satisfied, Mrs. Bennet called for her carriage. At this signal, the youngest of the Bennet girls stepped forward. Lydia and her sister had been whispering together in the corner for the entire visit, and they had clearly hatched a plan. Lydia was a tall, sturdy girl of 15 with a fine complexion and a cheerful, utterly unabashed face. She was her mother's clear favorite, an affection that had led to her being brought out into society at a very early age. She possessed boundless energy and a natural sense of self-importance, traits that had only been amplified by the constant attentions of the military officers, men drawn in by her uncle's excellent dinners and Lydia's own easy flirtations. She was, therefore, entirely unbothered by stepping directly up to Mr. Bingley to demand he make good on his promise to host a ball at Netherfield. She bluntly reminded him of his word, adding that it would be a terrible shame if he went back on it now. Bingley's response was music to Mrs. Bennet's ears. "I am perfectly ready to keep my promise, I assure you," he said. "Whenever your sister is fully recovered, you shall name the very day yourself. You wouldn't want to be dancing while she is upstairs ill, would you?" Lydia conceded the point. "Oh, yes, it will be much better to wait until Jane is well. By then, Captain Carter will likely be back in Meryton anyway, and once you have thrown your ball," she told Bingley, "I shall insist that the officers throw one too. I will tell Colonel Forster it would be an absolute disgrace if he didn't." With that settled, Mrs. Bennet and her daughters finally departed. Elizabeth rushed straight back upstairs to Jane, leaving her family's behavior to the mercy of the two Bingley ladies and Mr. Darcy. Darcy, however, steadfastly refused to join the women in their harsh critiques, remaining stubbornly silent no matter how many witty remarks Miss Bingley made at the expense of Elizabeth's fine eyes. Chapter X. The day unfolded much like the one before. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley spent the morning with the invalid, who continued to mend, albeit slowly. By evening, Elizabeth joined the party in the drawing-room. No one called for the card tables. Mr. Darcy was busy writing a letter, and Miss Bingley sat closely beside him, tracking his pen's progress. She interrupted his focus relentlessly, offering a steady stream of messages for his sister. Across the room, Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley played piquet, with Mrs. Hurst watching their hands. Elizabeth took up her needlework, perfectly entertained by the dynamic between Darcy and his companion. Miss Bingley delivered constant praise, admiring his handwriting, the flawless alignment of his lines, the impressive length of the letter. Darcy received her flattery with total indifference. It was a bizarre conversation, yet it perfectly matched Elizabeth's opinion of them both. "How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter," Miss Bingley said. He offered no reply. "You write uncommonly fast." "You are mistaken," Darcy said. "I write rather slowly." "How many letters you must have occasion to write over the course of a year. Business letters, too. I should think them perfectly odious." "It is fortunate, then, that they fall to my lot instead of to yours. Pray tell your sister that I long to see her." "I have already told her so once, by your desire." "I am afraid you do not like your pen," she insisted. "Let me mend it for you. I mend pens remarkably well." "Thank you, but I always mend my own." "How can you contrive to write so evenly?" He remained silent. "Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp. And pray let her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful little design for a table. I think it infinitely superior to Miss Grantley's. Will you give me leave to defer your raptures until I write again?" Darcy asked. "At present, I have not the room to do them justice." "Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But do you always write such charming, long letters to her, Mr. Darcy?" "They are generally long. Whether they are always charming is not for me to determine. It is a rule with me," she said, "that a person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill." "That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline," cried her brother from the card table. "He does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. Do you not, Darcy?" "My style of writing is very different from yours," Darcy replied. "Oh," Miss Bingley chimed in, "Charles writes in the most careless way imaginable. He leaves out half his words and blots the rest." "My ideas flow so rapidly that I have not the time to express them," Bingley said, "by which means my letters sometimes convey no ideas at all to my correspondents." "Your humility, Mr. Bingley," said Elizabeth, "must disarm all reproof." "Nothing is more deceitful," said Darcy, "than the appearance of humility. It is often only carelessness of opinion, and sometimes an indirect boast." "And which of the two do you call my little recent piece of modesty?" Bingley asked. "The indirect boast. You are really proud of your defects in writing, because you consider them as proceeding from a rapidity of thought and a carelessness of execution, which, if not estimable, you think at least highly interesting. The power of doing anything with quickness is always much prized by the possessor, often without any attention to the imperfection of the performance. When you told Mrs. Bennet this morning that if you ever resolved on quitting Netherfield you should be gone in 5 minutes, you meant it as a sort of panegyric, a compliment to yourself. And yet, what is there so very laudable in a precipitance which must leave necessary business undone, and can be of no real advantage to yourself or anyone else?" "Nay," cried Bingley, "this is too much, to remember at night all the foolish things that were said in the morning. And yet, upon my honor, I believed what I said of myself to be true, and I believe it at this moment. At least, therefore, I did not assume the character of needless precipitance merely to show off before the ladies. I dare say you believed it, Darcy said, but I am by no means convinced that you would be gone with such celerity. Your conduct would be quite as dependent on chance as that of any man I know. If, as you were mounting your horse, a friend were to say, "Bingley, you had better stay until next week," you would probably do it. You would probably not go, and, at another word, might stay a month. You have only proved by this, Elizabeth pointed out, that Mr. Bingley did not do justice to his own disposition. You have shown him off now much more than he did himself. I am exceedingly gratified, said Bingley, by your converting what my friend says into a compliment on the sweetness of my temper. But I am afraid you are giving it a turn which that gentleman did by no means intend. He would certainly think the better of me if, under such a circumstance, I were to give a flat denial, and ride off as fast as I could. Would Mr. Darcy then consider the rashness of your original intention as atoned for by your obstinacy in adhering to it? Elizabeth asked. Upon my word, I cannot exactly explain the matter. Darcy must speak for himself. You expect me to account for opinions which you choose to call mine, but which I have never acknowledged, Darcy told her. Allowing the case, however, to stand according to your representation, you must remember, Miss Bennet, that the friend who desires his return to the house has merely desired it, asked it without offering one argument in favor of its propriety. To yield readily, easily, to the persuasion of a friend is no merit with you. To yield without conviction is no compliment to the understanding of either. You appear to me, Mr. Darcy, to allow nothing for the influence of friendship and affection, Elizabeth said. A regard for the requester would often make one readily yield to a request without waiting for arguments to reason one into it. I am not particularly speaking of such a case as you have supposed about Mr. Bingley. We may as well wait, perhaps, until the circumstance occurs before we discuss the discretion of his behavior. But in general and ordinary cases, between friend and friend, where one of them is desired by the other to change a resolution of no very great moment, should you think ill of that person for complying with the desire, without waiting to be argued into it? Will it not be advisable, Darcy said, before we proceed on this subject, to arrange with rather more precision the degree of importance which is to appertain to this request, as well as the degree of intimacy subsisting between the parties? By all means, cried Bingley. Let us hear all the particulars, not forgetting their comparative height and size, for that will have more weight in the argument, Miss Bennet, than you may be aware of. I assure you that if Darcy were not such a great tall fellow, in comparison with myself, I should not pay him half so much deference. I declare I do not know a more awful object than Darcy on particular occasions, and in particular places, at his own house especially, and of a Sunday evening, when he has nothing to do. Darcy smiled, but Elizabeth thought she could perceive that he was rather offended, and she checked her laugh. Miss Bingley warmly resented the indignity he had received, scolding her brother for talking such nonsense. I see your design, Bingley, said his friend. You dislike an argument and want to silence this. Perhaps I do. Arguments are too much like disputes. If you and Miss Bennet will defer yours until I am out of the room, I shall be very thankful. Then you may say whatever you like of me. What you ask, said Elizabeth, is no sacrifice on my side, and Mr. Darcy had much better finish his letter. Darcy took her advice and did finish his letter. When that business was concluded, he applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for the indulgence of some music. Miss Bingley moved with alacrity to the pianoforte. She politely requested that Elizabeth lead the way. Elizabeth, as politely and much more earnestly, refused, and Miss Bingley took her seat. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister. While they were thus employed, Elizabeth turned over some music books that lay on the instrument, unable to help observing how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed upon her. She hardly knew how to suppose she could be an object of admiration to so great a man, yet the idea that he should look at her because he disliked her was stranger still. She could only imagine, at last, that she drew his notice because there was something about her more wrong and reprehensible, according to his ideas of right, than in any other person present. The supposition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. After playing some Italian songs, Miss Bingley varied the mood with a lively Scottish air. Soon afterward, Darcy drew near Elizabeth. Do you not feel a great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize such an opportunity of dancing a reel? She smiled but made no answer. He repeated the question, showing some surprise at her silence. "Oh," she said, "I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say, yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste. But I always delight in overthrowing those kind of schemes and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I have, therefore, made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all. And now, despise me if you dare." "Indeed, I do not dare." Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry. But there was a mixture of sweetness and archness in her manner which made it difficult for her to affront anybody, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as he was by her. He really believed that, were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected, enough to be jealous. Her great anxiety for the recovery of her dear friend Jane received considerable assistance from her desire to be rid of Elizabeth. She frequently tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest by talking of their supposed marriage, and planning his happiness in such an alliance. "I hope," Miss Bingley said, as they were walking together in the shrubbery the next day, "you will give your mother-in-law a few hints, when this desirable event takes place, as to the advantage of holding her tongue. And, if you can compass it, do cure the younger girls of running after the officers. And if I may mention so delicate a subject, endeavor to check that little something, bordering on conceit and impertinence, which your lady possesses." "Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity?" Darcy asked. "Oh, yes, do let the portraits of your uncle and Aunt Phillips be placed in the gallery at Pemberley. Put them next to your great-uncle the judge. They are in the same profession, you know, only in different lines. As for your Elizabeth's picture, you must not attempt to have it taken, for what painter could do justice to those beautiful eyes?" "It would not be easy, indeed, to catch their expression," he replied. "But their color and shape, and the eyelashes, so remarkably fine, might be copied." At that moment they were met, emerging from another walk, by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself. "I did not know that you intended to walk," said Miss Bingley, coloring in some confusion lest they had been overheard. "You used us abominably ill," Mrs. Hurst told her sister, "running away without telling us that you were coming out." Then, taking Mr. Darcy's disengaged arm, Mrs. Hurst left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path only admitted 3. Darcy felt their rudeness immediately. "This walk is not wide enough for our party," he said. "We had better go into the avenue." But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, "No, no, stay where you are. You are charmingly grouped and appear to uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoilt by admitting a 4th. Goodbye." She ran gaily off, rejoicing as she rambled about in the hope of being at home again in a day or 2. Jane was already so much recovered as to intend leaving her room for a couple of hours that evening. Chapter XI. When the ladies left the dining room after dinner, Elizabeth hurried upstairs to check on Jane. Finding her sister well bundled against the cold, she escorted her down to the drawing-room, where Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst welcomed Jane with eager declarations of delight. For the next hour, until the gentleman appeared, Elizabeth found the 2 sisters more agreeable than she had ever seen them. They were skilled conversationalists. They could vividly describe a party, tell a humorous anecdote, and gossip about their acquaintances with lively spirit. But the moment the drawing-room door opened and the men walked in, Jane was no longer the center of attention. Miss Bingley's eyes immediately locked onto Mr. Darcy, and she moved to speak with him before he had taken more than a few steps into the room. Darcy bypassed her just long enough to offer Jane a polite congratulation on her recovery. Mr. Hurst offered a slight bow and muttered that he was very glad to see her downstairs. But it was Mr. Bingley who provided all the warmth and enthusiasm. Overjoyed to have Jane back, he spent the first half-hour fussing over the fireplace to ensure she wouldn't catch a chill. He gently insisted she move to a chair on the far side of the hearth, safely away from any draught near the door. Once she was settled, he sat beside her and spoke to almost no one else. Tucked away in the opposite corner with her needlework, Elizabeth watched them with quiet delight. After tea, Mr. Hurst asked his sister-in-law to set up a card table, but his request was firmly denied. Miss Bingley had already deduced that Mr. Darcy had no interest in playing, so she assured Mr. Hurst that no one else was in the mood for a game. The silence of the rest of the room seemed to prove her right. Defeated, Mr. Hurst stretched out on a sofa and went asleep. Darcy picked up a book. Miss Bingley immediately did the same. Mrs. Hurst, busying herself with her rings and bracelets, only occasionally chimed in on her brother's conversation with Jane. Miss Bingley spent far more time tracking Mr. Darcy's progress through his novel than she did reading her own. She interrupted him constantly, asking questions and peering over at his page. Her efforts yielded nothing. Darcy merely answered her questions and kept reading. At last, quite exhausted by the effort of feigning interest in a book she had chosen solely because it was the second volume of his, she let out an exaggerated yawn. "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way," she declared. "I must say, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading. How much sooner one tires of anything else than of a book. When I finally have a house of my own, I shall be miserable if I do not possess an excellent library." Nobody answered her. She yawned again, tossed the book aside, and scanned the room for a distraction. Hearing her brother mention a ball to Jane, she pivoted suddenly toward him. "By the way, Charles, are you truly serious about hosting a dance here at Netherfield? Before you finalize anything, I would advise you to consult the wishes of the guests currently in the room. I would be very much mistaken if some of us did not view a ball as a punishment rather than a pleasure." "If you mean Darcy," Bingley replied, "he may go to bed before it begins if he chooses. But as for the ball, it is quite a settled matter. As soon as Mrs. Nishalls has prepared enough white soup, I shall send around the invitations." "I would like balls infinitely better if they were conducted in a different manner," she sighed. "There is something insufferably tedious in the usual routine of such a gathering. It would surely be much more rational if conversation, rather than dancing, were the order of the day." "Much more rational, my dear Caroline, I am sure," said Bingley. "But it wouldn't be near so much like a ball." Miss Bingley made no answer to this. After a moment, she stood and began to pace gracefully about the room. Her figure was elegant and her posture perfect, but Darcy, the sole intended audience for this display, remained stubbornly focused on his reading. Driven to desperation, she turned toward the corner. "Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example and take a turn about the room. I assure you, it is remarkably refreshing after sitting in one position for so long." Elizabeth was surprised by the invitation, but she immediately agreed. The maneuver achieved Miss Bingley's true goal. Mr. Darcy finally looked up. He was just as curious about this sudden burst of friendship as Elizabeth was, and he unconsciously closed his book. Miss Bingley promptly invited him to join their stroll. He declined, observing that he could imagine only two possible motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, and his joining them would interfere with either one. "Whatever could he mean?" Miss Bingley asked, dying to know the answer. She looked to Elizabeth. "Can you understand him at all?" "Not at all," Elizabeth replied. "But depend upon it, he means to be severe with us, and our surest method of disappointing him is to ask nothing about it." But Miss Bingley was incapable of disappointing Mr. Darcy in anything. She persisted, demanding that he explain his two motives. "I have not the smallest objection to explaining them," Darcy said, once she finally allowed him to speak. "You have either chosen this method of passing the evening because you share each other's confidence and have secret affairs to discuss, or because you are aware that your figures appear to their greatest advantage while walking. If it is the first reason, I should be completely in your way. And if it is the second, I can admire you much better as I sit by the fire." "Oh, shocking," Miss Bingley cried. "I never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?" "Nothing could be easier if you have but the inclination," Elizabeth said. "We can all plague and punish one another, tease him, laugh at him. Intimate as you are with him, you must know how it is to be done." "Upon my honor, I do not. I do assure you our intimacy has not yet taught me that. How does one tease such perfect calmness of temper and presence of mind? No, no, I feel he may defy us there. And as for laughter, we will not expose ourselves by attempting to laugh without a proper subject. Mr. Darcy may consider himself safe." "Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at?" Elizabeth cried. "That is an uncommon advantage, and I hope it remains uncommon, for it would be a great loss to me to have many such acquaintances. I dearly love a laugh." "Miss Bingley has given me credit for more than is possible," Darcy said. "The wisest and best of men, and the wisest and best of their actions, may be rendered ridiculous by a person whose first object in life is a joke." "Certainly," Elizabeth agreed, "there are such people, but I hope I am not one of them. I hope I never ridicule what is wise or good. Follies and nonsense, whims and inconsistencies, those do divert me, I own, and I laugh at them whenever I can. But those, I suppose, are precisely the traits you are without. Perhaps that is not possible for anyone, Darcy said. But it has been the study of my life to avoid those weaknesses which so often expose a strong understanding to ridicule. Such as vanity and pride. Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed. But pride, where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will always be under good regulation. Elizabeth turned her head away to hide a smile. Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume? Miss Bingley asked. And pray, what is the result? I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect, Elizabeth said. He admits it himself, without disguise. No, Darcy said quickly. I have made no such pretension. I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, faults of understanding. My temper, however, I dare not vouch for. It is, I believe, too little yielding, certainly too little for the convenience of the world. I cannot forget the follies and vices of others as soon as I ought to, nor their offenses against myself. My feelings are not puffed about by every attempt to move them. My temper might perhaps be called resentful. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever. Now that is a genuine failing, Elizabeth cried. Implacable resentment is a dark shadow on a character, but you have chosen your fault well. I really cannot laugh at it. You are safe from me. There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency toward some particular evil, Darcy said. A natural defect, which not even the best education can overcome. And your defect is a propensity to hate everybody. And yours, he replied with a smile, is to willfully misunderstand them. Do let us have a little music, cried Miss Bingley, entirely tired of a conversation in which she had no share. Louisa, you will not mind my waking Mr. Hurst. Her sister made not the smallest objection, and the pianoforte was opened. After a few moments of reflection, Darcy found he was not sorry for the interruption. He was beginning to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth Bennet too much attention. Chapter XII. Having agreed it was time to go, Elizabeth wrote to her mother the following morning, asking her to send the carriage for them later that day. But Mrs. Bennet had already mapped out the visit in her head. She fully expected her daughters to remain at Netherfield until Tuesday, which would round out Jane's stay to exactly 1 week. Receiving them back, a moment sooner held no appeal for her whatsoever. Consequently, her reply was thoroughly disappointing to Elizabeth, who was impatient to get home. Mrs. Bennet informed them that the carriage would be entirely unavailable before Tuesday. In a postscript, she added that if Mr. Bingley and his sister pressed them to extend the visit, she could certainly spare them a while longer. Elizabeth, however, was stubbornly resolved against staying. She doubted they would even be asked to remain, and she dreaded the thought of outstaying their welcome. She urged Jane to ask to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage instead. After a brief discussion, they announced their intention to leave Netherfield that very morning and formally requested the use of his horses. This announcement sparked a flurry of polite protests. The Bingleys expressed deep concern and insisted the sisters stay at least one more day. Jane finally yielded, and their departure was postponed until the morrow. Miss Bingley instantly regretted suggesting the delay, as her resentment of Elizabeth far outweighed any fondness she held for Jane. The master of the house, however, was genuinely distressed to lose them so soon. Mr. Bingley tried repeatedly to convince Jane that she was not yet entirely recovered and that traveling would be dangerous for her. But Jane knew her own strength and held firm to what she knew was right. For Mr. Darcy, the news was a profound relief. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield quite long enough. She drew his attention far more than he liked, a fact that only provoked Miss Bingley into treating Elizabeth with overt rudeness and Darcy with incessant teasing. He made a calculated resolution to show no further sign of admiration. He refused to give Elizabeth the slightest reason to hope she might win his heart. Recognizing that his recent behavior might have given her exactly that impression, he was determined to stamp out the idea entirely. Staying strictly true to his vow, he spoke barely 10 words to her throughout the entirety of Saturday. At one point, the two of them were left completely alone in a room for half an hour. Darcy clung conscientiously to his book, refusing to cast even a single glance in her direction. On Sunday, following morning church services, the parting finally took place, to the immense satisfaction of nearly everyone involved. In those final moments, Miss Bingley's politeness toward Elizabeth underwent a rapid, miraculous improvement, matching a sudden surge of affection for Jane. As they said their goodbyes, she embraced Jane tenderly, assured her they would be delighted to see her at either Longbourn or Netherfield, and even managed to shake Elizabeth's hand. Elizabeth bid the household farewell in remarkably high spirits. Their welcome at home was remarkably frigid. Mrs. Bennet marveled that they had returned at all, scolded them for causing so much unnecessary trouble, and declared her absolute certainty that Jane would catch a new chill. Their father, however, was quietly delighted. Though he was a man of few words, he was genuinely glad to see his eldest daughters walk through the door. Without Jane and Elizabeth, the family's evening conversations had lost most of their liveliness and nearly all of their common sense. They found Mary exactly as they had left her, deeply engrossed in the study of thorough bass and human nature. She was eager to share several newly copied extracts for them to admire, along with a few thoroughly worn-out moral observations. Catherine and Lydia possessed news of a vastly different variety. A great deal had happened, and even more had been gossiped about, in the militia regiment since the preceding Wednesday. Several officers had recently dined with their uncle, a private had been flogged, and a thrilling rumor was circulating that Colonel Forster was soon to be married. "I hope, my dear Mr. Bennet said to his wife from across the breakfast table the next morning, that you have ordered a good dinner for today. I have reason to expect an addition to our family party." "Who do you mean, my dear? I know of nobody who is coming, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call in, and I hope my dinners are good enough for her. I do not believe she often sees such meals at home. The person of whom I speak is a gentleman and a stranger." Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled. "A gentleman and a stranger? It is Mr. Bingley, I am sure. Why, Jane, you sly thing, you never dropped a word of this. Well, I am sure I shall be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley. But good Lord, how unlucky, there is not a single bit of fish to be got today. Lydia, my love, ring the bell, I must speak to Hill this instant." "It is not Mr. Bingley," her husband said. "It is a person whom I have never seen in the whole course of my life." This roused general astonishment, and Mr. Bennet had the pleasure of being eagerly questioned by his wife and all 5 of his daughters at once. After amusing himself for some time with their frantic curiosity, he finally offered an explanation. "About a month ago, I received a letter. About a fortnight ago, I answered it, for I thought it a case of some delicacy that required early attention. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, the very man who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases." "Oh, my dear," cried his wife, "I cannot bear to hear that mentioned. Pray do not talk of that odious man. I do think it is the hardest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children. If I had been you, I should have tried long ago to do something or other about it." Jane and Elizabeth attempted to explain the legal nature of an entail to her. They had tried many times before, but it was a subject on which Mrs. Bennet remained entirely beyond the reach of reason. She continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters, all in favor of a man whom nobody cared anything about. "It certainly is a most iniquitous affair," said Mr. Bennet, "and nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But if you will listen to his letter, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself." "No, I am sure I shall not. I think it was very impertinent of him to write to you at all, and very hypocritical. I hate such false friends. Why could he not keep on quarreling with you, just as his father did before him? Why, indeed, he does seem to have had some filial scruples on that head, as you will hear." Mr. Bennet drew the paper from his pocket and read aloud. "Hunsford near Westerham, Kent, 15th of October. Dear Sir Asterisk, the disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honored father always gave me much uneasiness. Since I have had the misfortune to lose him, I have frequently wished to heal the breach. For some time, however, I was kept back by my own doubts, fearing it might seem disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with anyone with whom it had always pleased him to be at variance." Mr. Bennet paused, casting a pointed glance at his wife. "There, Mrs. Bennet," he returned to the page. "My mind, however, is now made up on the subject, for, having received ordination at Easter, I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh, widow of Sir Louis de Bourgh. Her bounty and beneficence has preferred me to the valuable rectory of this parish. Here it shall be my earnest endeavour to conduct myself with grateful respect towards her ladyship, and be ever ready to perform those rites and ceremonies instituted by the Church of England. As a clergyman, moreover, I feel it my duty to promote and establish the blessing of peace in all families within the reach of my influence. On these grounds, I flatter myself that my present overtures of goodwill are highly commendable, and that the circumstance of my being next in the entail of the Longbourn estate will be kindly overlooked on your side, and not lead you to reject the offered olive branch. I cannot be otherwise than concerned at being the means of injuring your amiable daughters, and beg leave to apologize for it, as well as to assure you of my readiness to make them every possible amends, but of this hereafter. If you should have no objection to receiving me into your house, I propose myself the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family on Monday, November 18th, by 4 o'clock. I shall probably trespass on your hospitality until Saturday of the following week, which I can do without any inconvenience. Lady Catherine is far from objecting to my occasional absence on a Sunday, provided that some other clergyman is engaged to do the duties of the day. I remain, dear sir, with respectful compliments to your lady and daughters, your well-wisher and friend, William Collins. At 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman, said Mr. Bennet, folding up the letter. He seems to be a most conscientious and polite young man, upon my word, and I doubt not he will prove a valuable acquaintance, especially if Lady Catherine should be so indulgent as to let him come to us again. There is some sense in what he says about the girls, however, Mrs. Bennet admitted. If he is disposed to make them any amends, I shall not be the person to discourage him. Though it is difficult to guess in what way he can mean to make us the atonement he thinks our due, said Jane, the wish is certainly to his credit. Elizabeth was chiefly struck by the man's extraordinary deference to Lady Catherine, and his highly obliging intention of christening, marrying, and burying his parishioners whenever required. He must be an oddity, I think, she said. I cannot make him out. There is something very pompous in his style. And what can he mean by apologizing for being next in the entail? We cannot suppose he would stop it if he could. Can he be a sensible man, sir? No, my dear, I think not. I have great hopes of finding him quite the reverse. There is a mixture of servility and self-importance in his letter which promises well. I am impatient to see him. In point of composition, Mary observed, his letter does not seem defective. The idea of the olive branch is perhaps not wholly new, yet I think it is well expressed. To Kitty and Lydia, neither the letter nor its writer held any interest. It was next to impossible that their cousin should arrive wearing the scarlet coat of a militia officer, and it had been weeks since they had taken any pleasure in the society of a man in a coat of any other color. As for their mother, Mr. Collins's mention of making amends had wiped away much of her ill will. She prepared to receive him with a degree of composure that left her husband and daughters astounded. Mr. Collins proved perfectly punctual. He was received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet said very little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed neither in need of encouragement nor inclined to sit in silence. He was a tall, heavy-looking young man of 25. His air was grave and stately, and his manners were intensely formal. He had not been seated for long before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having such a fine family of daughters. He remarked that he had heard much of their beauty, but that in this instance, rumor had fallen short of the truth. He added that he did not doubt she would see them all well disposed of in marriage in due time. This particular brand of gallantry was not entirely to the taste of some of his listeners, but Mrs. Bennet, who never quarreled with a compliment, answered readily. You are very kind, sir, I am sure, and I wish with all my heart it may prove so, for otherwise they will be destitute enough. Things are settled so oddly. You allude, perhaps, to the entail of this estate. Ah, sir, I do indeed. It is a grievous affair for my poor girls, you must confess. Not that I mean to find fault with you, for I know such things are all left to chance in this world. There is no knowing how estates will go once they are entailed. I am very sensible, madam, of the hardship to my fair cousins, and could say much on the subject, but that I am cautious of appearing forward and precipitate. I can assure the young ladies, however, that I come prepared to admire them. At present I will say no more, but perhaps, when we are better acquainted. He was interrupted by a summons to dinner, and the girls smiled at one another. They were not the only objects of Mr. Collins's admiration. The hall, the dining room, and all of its furniture were meticulously examined and praised. His high commendation of everything would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart entirely, if not for the mortifying thought that he was viewing it all as his own future property. The dinner, in its turn, was highly admired. He begged to know to which of his fair cousins the excellence of the cookery was owed. Here he was firmly set right by Mrs. Bennet. With a touch of asperity, she assured him that they were perfectly well able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters had absolutely nothing to do in the kitchen. He begged her pardon for having displeased her. In a softened tone, she declared herself not at all offended. Unfazed by her forgiveness, Mr. Collins continued to apologize for a quarter of an hour. Mr. Bennet barely spoke a word during dinner, but once the servants had cleared the table and withdrawn, he decided it was time to draw out his guest. He deliberately introduced a subject in which he expected Mr. Collins to shine, remarking on how exceedingly fortunate the clergyman seemed in his patroness. Lady Catherine de Bourgh's attention to his wishes and her consideration for his comfort appeared truly remarkable. Mr. Bennet could not have thrown better bait. Mr. Collins immediately grew eloquent in her praise. The subject elevated his posture to one of supreme solemnity. With an air of vast self-importance, he declared that never in his life had he witnessed such behavior in a person of rank. The sheer affability, the gracious condescension he had personally experienced from Lady Catherine was beyond compare. She had been graciously pleased, he went on, to approve of both the discourses he had had the honor of preaching before her. She had already asked him twice to dine at Rosings, and had even sent for him just the Saturday before to make up her pool of quadrille for the evening. Some people, he knew, considered Lady Catherine proud, but he had seen nothing but affability from her. She had always spoken to him exactly as she would to any other gentleman. She made not the slightest objection to his joining the society of the neighborhood, nor to his occasionally leaving his parish for a week or two to visit his relations. She had even condescended to advise him to marry as soon as he could, provided he chose with discretion. Why, she had once paid a personal visit to his humble parsonage, perfectly approving all the alterations he had been making, and had even vouchsafed to suggest a few improvements herself, specifically, the addition of some shelves in the upstairs closets. "That is all very proper and civil, I am sure," said Mrs. Bennet, "and I dare say she is a very agreeable woman. It is a pity that great ladies in general are not more like her. Does she live near you, sir?" "The garden of my humble abode," Mr. Collins replied, "is separated only by a narrow lane from Rosings Park, her ladyship's residence." "I think you said she was a widow, sir. Does she have any family?" "She has one only daughter, the heiress of Rosings, and a very extensive property." "Ah," Mrs. Bennet shook her head in deep appreciation, "then she is better off than many girls. And what sort of young lady is she? Is she handsome?" "She is a most charming young lady, indeed. Lady Catherine herself says that, in point of true beauty, Miss de Bourgh is far superior to the handsomest of her sex, because there is that in her features which marks the young woman of distinguished birth. She is unfortunately of a sickly constitution, which has prevented her from making the sort of progress in her accomplishments that she could not otherwise have failed to achieve, as I am informed by the lady who superintended her education, and who still resides with them. But she is perfectly amiable, and she often condescends to drive by my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies." "Has she been presented?" Mrs. Bennet asked. "I do not remember her name among the ladies at court." "Her indifferent state of health unhappily prevents her being in town. And by that means, as I told Lady Catherine myself one day, her absence has deprived the British court of its brightest ornament. Her ladyship seemed quite pleased with the idea. You may imagine that I am happy on every occasion to offer those little delicate compliments which are always acceptable to ladies. I have more than once observed to Lady Catherine that her charming daughter seemed born to be a duchess, and that the most elevated rank, instead of giving her consequence, would be adorned by her. These are the kind of little things which please her ladyship, and it is a sort of attention which I conceive myself peculiarly bound to pay." "You judge very properly," said Mr. Bennet, his face a mask of perfect gravity, "and it is happy for you that you possess the talent of flattering with such delicacy. May I ask whether these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are the result of previous study?" "They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time," Mr. Collins answered. "And though I sometimes amuse myself with suggesting and arranging such little elegant compliments as may be adapted to ordinary occasions, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible." Mr. Bennet's expectations were fully answered. His cousin was exactly as absurd as he had hoped. He listened to the clergyman with the keenest enjoyment, maintaining the most resolute composure of countenance, and, except for an occasional, knowing glance at Elizabeth, requiring no partner in his pleasure. By tea-time, however, the dose had been enough. Mr. Bennet was glad to take his guest into the drawing-room again, and once tea was over, he invited Mr. Collins to read aloud to the ladies. Mr. Collins readily agreed, and a book was produced. But the moment he laid eyes on it, for everything about the volume announced it had come from a circulating library, he started back. Begging their pardon, he protested that he never read novels. Kitty stared at him, and Lydia cried out in disbelief. Other books were quickly brought forward. After some deliberation, Mr. Collins selected *Fordyce's Sermons*. Lydia let out a wide, unconcealed yawn the moment he opened the volume. He began to read with a very monotonous, droning solemnity, but before he had gotten through 3 pages, she cut him off entirely. "Do you know, Mamma, that my Uncle Phillips talks of turning away Richard?" she said, "and if he does, Colonel Forster will hire him. My aunt told me so herself on Saturday. I shall walk to Meryton tomorrow to hear more about it, and to ask when Mr. Denny comes back from town." Her 2 eldest sisters immediately ordered her to hold her tongue, but the damage was done. Mr. Collins, deeply offended, laid aside the book. "I have often observed how little young ladies are interested by books of a serious stamp, though written solely for their benefit," he said stiffly. "It amazes me, I confess, for certainly there can be nothing so advantageous to them as instruction, but I will no longer importune my young cousin." Turning to Mr. Bennet, he offered himself as his antagonist at backgammon. Mr. Bennet accepted the challenge, dryly observing that his cousin acted very wisely in leaving the girls to their own trifling amusements. Mrs. Bennet and her daughters apologized most profusely for Lydia's interruption, promising it would not happen again if only he would resume his book. Mr. Collins assured them that he bore his young cousin no ill will and would never resent her behavior as an affront. Then, having thoroughly made his point, he seated himself at another table with Mr. Bennet and prepared for backgammon. Mr. Collins was not, by any stretch of the imagination, a sensible man. Nature had given him very little to work with, and neither education nor society had done much to improve the deficit. He had spent the bulk of his youth under the heavy thumb of an illiterate, tight-fisted father. While he had technically attended one of the universities, he had merely put in the required time without making any useful connections. His oppressive upbringing had originally instilled in him a deep, awkward humility, but this had lately been overwritten by the conceit of a weak mind. Living in isolation, suddenly thrust into early and unexpected prosperity, he had developed a staggering sense of his own importance. A stroke of luck had brought him to the attention of Lady Catherine de Bourgh, just as the living of Hunsford fell vacant. His profound respect for her aristocratic rank, combined with his high opinion of himself as a clergyman, had turned him into a bizarre walking contradiction. He was at once incredibly arrogant and perfectly groveling, a blend of utter self-importance and shameless subservience. Now that he possessed a good house and a comfortable income, he was ready to marry. In seeking to heal the rift with the Longbourn family, he fully intended to choose a wife from among his cousins, provided they were as pretty and pleasant as neighborhood gossip claimed. This was his grand plan for making amends. Since he was destined to inherit their father's estate, he considered it an incredibly generous, noble, and entirely unselfish scheme. Meeting the girls in person did nothing to alter his intentions. Jane's lovely face immediately confirmed his plans, and satisfying his strict notions of birth order, the eldest became his firm choice for the duration of his first evening at Longbourn. The very next morning, however, required a pivot. Finding himself alone with Mrs. Bennet for 15 minutes before breakfast, he began by describing his parsonage and smoothly transitioned into the hope that he might find a mistress for it in her home. Mrs. Bennet offered a barrage of encouraging smiles, but quickly issued a gentle caution regarding Jane. As for her younger girls, she could not say for certain. She knew of no prior attachments, but she felt it her absolute duty to hint that her eldest daughter was very likely to be engaged quite soon. Mr. Collins simply had to transfer his affections from Jane to Elizabeth. The shift was accomplished in the time it took Mrs. Bennet to stir the fire. Elizabeth was the next oldest and equally beautiful, so she naturally inherited his favor. Mrs. Bennet absorbed the implication with delight, her hopes soaring at the prospect of seeing two daughters married in short order. The very man she had loathed the day before was now firmly established in her good graces. Meanwhile, Lydia had not forgotten her plan to walk into Meryton, and every sister except Mary agreed to join her. Mr. Bennet eagerly requested that Mr. Collins accompany them. He was desperate to get the man out of the house so he could have his library back. After breakfast, Mr. Collins had trailed him into his private sanctuary, holding one of the largest folio volumes in the collection as a prop, though he did no actual reading. Instead, he talked endlessly about his house and garden at Hunsford. This had rattled Mr. Bennet terribly. His library was his guaranteed refuge of quiet and leisure. As he had told Elizabeth, he was prepared to endure foolishness and conceit in every other room of the house, but he demanded peace in his study. Therefore, he was incredibly quick to suggest that Mr. Collins escort the girls. Mr. Collins, who was far better suited to walking than reading anyway, cheerfully closed his massive book and agreed. The walk to Meryton passed with pompous rambling from Mr. Collins and polite, empty agreement from his cousins. But the moment they reached the town, the younger girls ceased paying him any attention. Their eyes instantly began scanning the street for military coats. From that point on, nothing short of a spectacular new bonnet or a truly striking muslin in a shop window could distract them. Soon, however, the attention of every woman in the group was captured by a young man they had never seen before. He was entirely gentlemanlike, walking on the opposite side of the street with an officer. The officer was none other than Mr. Denny, the very man Lydia had come to ask after following his trip to London. He bowed as they passed. The stranger's presence was captivating. Everyone wondered who he could be. Kitty and Lydia, determined to find out, dragged the group across the street, feigning an urgent need to visit a shop on the other side. They timed their interception perfectly, stepping onto the pavement just as the two gentlemen turned back and reached the same spot. Mr. Denny immediately stopped to greet them and asked permission to introduce his friend, Mr. Wickham. He explained that Wickham had traveled back from London with him the day before and, to his great delight, had just accepted a commission in their regiment. This was the final piece of the puzzle. The young man only needed a uniform to be completely devastating. He had everything working in his favor: a striking face, an excellent figure, and effortless charm. He followed up the introduction with an easy, engaging flow of conversation that was polite without being pushy. The whole group was standing together, talking happily on the street, when the clatter of hooves drew their attention. Darcy and Bingley were riding through town. Spotting the ladies, the two men rode straight over to offer their greetings. Bingley did most of the talking, aiming almost all of it at Jane, explaining that he had been on his way to Longbourn expressly to check on her. Mr. Darcy backed up the claim with a polite bow. He was just resolving not to let his eyes linger on Elizabeth when his gaze snagged on the stranger. Elizabeth happened to be watching Darcy and Wickham as they locked eyes, and she was entirely bewildered by what happened next. Both men changed color. One went stark white, the other flushed deep red. After a tense, agonizing moment, Mr. Wickham reached up and briefly touched his hat. Mr. Darcy barely inclined his head in return. What in the world did it mean? It was impossible to guess, and equally impossible not to desperately want to know. A moment later, Bingley took his leave, apparently oblivious to the silent drama that had just played out, and rode on with his friend. Mr. Denny and Mr. Wickham walked the ladies as far as Mrs. Phillips's front door. There, they bowed and took their leave, despite Lydia's loud begging that they come inside, and despite her aunt throwing up the parlor window to echo the invitation from above. Mrs. Phillips was always thrilled to see her nieces. Jane and Elizabeth, having been away at Netherfield, were especially welcome. She immediately began chattering about her surprise at their sudden return, explaining that since their own carriage hadn't been sent for them, she wouldn't have known they were back at all if she hadn't run into Mr. Jones's errand boy in the street. He had informed her there was no need to send any more medicine to Netherfield, because the Bennet girls had gone home. Her rambling was only interrupted when Jane formally introduced Mr. Collins. Mrs. Phillips greeted him with her absolute best manners, and he returned the favor with even greater formality, apologizing deeply for intruding on a lady he did not know. He expressed a flattering hope that his connection to her nieces might excuse his boldness. Mrs. Phillips was entirely overwhelmed by such an intense display of good breeding. However, her awe over one stranger was soon replaced by frantic questions about the other. She could only tell her nieces what they had already heard. Mr. Denny had brought the man from London, and he was getting a lieutenant's commission. She admitted she had been watching Wickham pace up and down the street for the last hour. If he had still been out there, Kitty and Lydia would undoubtedly have joined her at the glass. Unfortunately, the only people passing the window now were a few of the regular officers, who suddenly seemed incredibly boring and inadequate compared to the handsome newcomer. Mrs. Phillips mentioned that several of the officers were coming to dine with them the following day. She promised to make her husband call on Mr. Wickham to invite him as well, provided the Longbourn family would come over for the evening. The girls eagerly agreed. Mrs. Phillips promised a loud, cozy game of lottery tickets, followed by a hot supper. The prospect was highly encouraging, and the group eventually parted in excellent spirits, with Mr. Collins offering a fresh round of elaborate apologies for leaving, which Mrs. Phillips tirelessly assured him were completely unnecessary. On the walk back to Longbourn, Elizabeth quietly told Jane everything she had witnessed between the two men on horseback and the new soldier. Jane, who would have happily defended either man if they had seemed at fault, was just as mystified by the encounter as her sister. Upon returning to the house, Mr. Collins thoroughly delighted Mrs. Bennet by raving about her sister's exceptional manners. He firmly declared that, aside from Lady Catherine and her daughter, he had never met a more elegant woman than Mrs. Phillips. Not only had she received him with utter politeness, she had actively included him in a dinner invitation despite having never met him before. He supposed a small fraction of her kindness might be due to his connection to the Bennet family, but he insisted that he had never experienced such flattering attention in his entire life. Since no one objected to the younger set keeping their plans with their aunt, and since Mr. Collins had been successfully talked out of his reservations about leaving Mr. and Mrs. Bennet alone for a single evening, the carriage carried the clergyman and his 5 cousins to Meryton at a respectable hour. The moment the girls stepped into their aunt's drawing room, they were delighted to hear that Mr. Wickham had accepted their uncle's invitation and was already waiting inside. Once everyone had taken their seats, Mr. Collins finally had a moment to inspect his surroundings. He was so struck by the impressive size and furnishings of the room that he loudly declared it reminded him of the small summer breakfast parlor at Rosings. Aunt Phillips didn't quite know how to take the comparison at first. But once she understood exactly what Rosings was, who owned it, and that a single fireplace in one of Lady Catherine's sitting rooms had cost £800, she absorbed the full weight of the compliment. She listened with rapt attention, already planning how to repeat every lavish detail to her neighbors. Mr. Collins happily passed the time spinning tales of Lady Catherine's grandeur, peppered with modest digressions about the improvements being made to his own humble parsonage. Mrs. Phillips proved a captivated audience, her respect for his social standing growing with every word. But for the girls, who found their cousin intolerable, the wait for the gentleman felt endless. They had nothing to do but wish for a piano and stare blankly at the cheap imitation china on the mantelpiece. At last, the wait was over. The men entered the room, and the moment Mr. Wickham appeared, Elizabeth felt that all her previous admiration had been entirely justified. The local militia officers were, by and large, a respectable, gentlemanly group, but Mr. Wickham outshone every one of them in posture, expression, and grace, just as thoroughly as the officers outshone Elizabeth's broad-faced, wheezing Uncle Phillips, who trailed in behind them smelling heavily of port wine. Wickham was the center of attention, drawing the eyes of nearly every woman in the room, but Elizabeth was the lucky one he chose to sit beside. He seamlessly struck up a conversation, and though they only spoke about the wet evening and the likelihood of a rainy season, his charm transformed the most threadbare topic into something utterly captivating. Next to Wickham and the officers, Mr. Collins practically vanished. The young women ignored him completely, though Mrs. Phillips remained attentive, hovering over him with endless supplies of coffee and muffins. When the card tables were finally set up, he returned her kindness by joining her for a game of whist. "I know very little of the game at present," Mr. Collins announced, "but I am eager to improve myself in my station in life." Mrs. Phillips thanked him for playing, but didn't wait around to hear his reasoning. Mr. Wickham did not play whist. Instead, he gladly took a seat at the other table, wedged right between Elizabeth and Lydia. For a moment, it seemed Lydia's relentless chatter might monopolize him entirely. Fortunately, she was deeply invested in the lottery game, and her intense focus on placing bets and screaming over her prizes soon left Wickham free to talk to Elizabeth. She was more than willing to listen, even if she knew she couldn't dare ask about the one thing she desperately wanted to know: his history with Mr. Darcy. To her surprise, Wickham brought it up himself. He asked how far Netherfield was from Meryton, and then, with a slight hesitation, asked how long Mr. Darcy had been staying there. "About a month," Elizabeth replied. Unwilling to let the opening slip away, she added, "I understand he is a man of massive property in Derbyshire." "Yes, his estate there is magnificent," Wickham said. "A clear 10,000 a year, and you couldn't have found anyone better qualified to tell you about him. I have been intimately connected to his family since I was a baby." Elizabeth couldn't hide her shock. "You have every right to be surprised, Miss Bennet, especially if you noticed the freezing reception we gave each other yesterday. Are you well acquainted with Mr. Darcy?" "As well as I ever care to be," Elizabeth said heatedly. "I spent 4 days in the same house with him, and I find him deeply unpleasant." "It isn't my place to judge whether he is agreeable or not," Wickham said carefully. "I've known him far too long and too well to be impartial, but I think your opinion of him would surprise most people. Perhaps you wouldn't speak so strongly outside your own family." "I promise you, I'd say the exact same thing in any house in this county, except Netherfield itself. Nobody in Hertfordshire likes him. Everyone is repulsed by his arrogance. You won't find anyone who speaks favorably of him." Wickham paused for a moment. "I can't pretend to be sorry that he, or any man, is judged exactly as he deserves. But with Darcy, that rarely happens. The world is blinded by his wealth and status, or intimidated by his imposing manners. People only see what he wants them to see." "Even from my brief acquaintance," Elizabeth said, "I'd say he has a terrible temper." Wickham shook his head, waiting for another lull in the surrounding chatter. "I wonder if he plans to stay in this area much longer." "I have no idea. I didn't hear any talk of him leaving while I was at Netherfield. I hope his presence won't force you to change your plans with the militia." "Oh no, Mr. Darcy won't drive me away. If he wants to avoid seeing me, he'll have to leave. It's true we aren't on friendly terms and seeing him is always painful, but I have no reason to hide. My only grievance is one I could shout to the whole world: I have been treated terribly and I deeply regret what he has become. Miss Bennet, his father, the late Mr. Darcy, was one of the finest men who ever breathed and the truest friend I ever had. Seeing the current Mr. Darcy tears at me with 1,000 tender memories. His behavior toward me has been scandalous. I honestly think I could forgive him for anything, except for betraying his father's hopes and disgracing his memory." Elizabeth listened with all her heart, completely captivated, though she knew the subject was too delicate to press with direct questions. Wickham smoothly shifted to safer topics, praising Meryton, the neighborhood, and the local society with a gentle, flattering charm. "The promise of constant, excellent society was my main reason for joining the regiment," he explained. "It's a highly respectable group, and my friend Denny tempted me with stories of their great quarters and the warm welcome Meryton has given them. I admit I need society. I am a disappointed man, and I cannot bear to be alone. I need work and company. The military wasn't my intended path. I was actually raised for the church. I should be holding a highly valuable living right now, if it hadn't been for the very gentleman we were just discussing." "What?" "Yes, the late Mr. Darcy left me the next presentation to the best living in his gift. He was my godfather, and he cared for me deeply. I can't even begin to describe his kindness. He thought he had secured my future, but when the position became available, it was given to someone else." "Good heavens," Elizabeth cried. "How is that possible? How could his will be ignored? Didn't you take it to court?" "There was a minor technicality in the wording of the bequest. Legally, I had no hope. A man of honor wouldn't have hesitated to fulfill the intention, but Mr. Darcy chose to doubt it. He treated it as a mere recommendation, claiming I had forfeited my right to it through extravagance and recklessness, basically, using any excuse he could invent. The living opened up 2 years ago, right when I was old enough to take it, and he handed it to another man. I swear to you, I did nothing to deserve it. I have a quick temper, and perhaps I spoke my mind to him too freely a few times. That is the worst I can recall. The simple truth is that we are very different men, and he hates me. That is horrific. He deserves to be publicly shamed. He will be someday, but not by me. Until I can forget his father, I will never expose the son." Elizabeth felt a rush of admiration for his nobility, thinking him more handsome than ever in that moment. But what could possibly be his motive, she asked. Why would he be so cruel? A deep, absolute dislike of me, which I think stems mostly from jealousy. If his father had loved me less, the son might have tolerated me better. But the late Mr. Darcy's unusual affection for me irritated him from a very young age. He couldn't handle the competition, or the fact that I was so often preferred over him. I never liked him, Elizabeth said, but I never imagined he was this bad. I thought he merely looked down on everyone else. I didn't suspect him of actual malice and inhumanity. She paused, thinking back. Actually, I recall him boasting at Netherfield about his unforgiving temper. He said his resentment was implacable. His disposition must be dreadful. I can't trust myself to speak on it, Wickham said quietly. I could never be fair to him. Elizabeth sat in stunned silence before breaking out, to treat his father's godson and favorite like that. She thought, but didn't say, a young man like you, with such an obviously kind face. Instead, she added, someone who was his childhood companion, raised so closely with him. We were born in the same parish, raised in the same park. We spent most of our youth together in the same house, sharing the same games and the same parental care. My father managed the Pemberley estate. He gave up his own career to serve the late Mr. Darcy, and he became his most trusted, confidential friend. Mr. Darcy always said how much he owed my father's active management. When he promised to provide for me right before my father died, I know he saw it as a debt of gratitude to my father as much as affection for me. It's repulsive, Elizabeth said. I'm shocked his own pride didn't force him to be fair to you, if only to avoid the stain of dishonesty, because that's exactly what this is. It is strange, Wickham agreed. Almost everything he does is driven by pride. And honestly, pride has been his best friend. It keeps him closer to virtue than anything else. But humans are inconsistent. In his treatment of me, his resentment overpowered even his pride. Has his pride ever actually done him any good? Yes, it makes him generous. He gives his money away freely, entertains lavishly, helps his tenants, and supports the poor. Family pride, and the desire to honor his father's legacy, demands it. He refuses to look like he's degrading the family name or losing the influence of the Pemberley estate. He also has brotherly pride, which makes him a very careful guardian of his sister. You will often hear him praised as the most devoted brother in the world. What is Miss Darcy like? Wickham shook his head. I wish I could say something kind. It hurts to speak ill of any Darcy, but she is exactly like her brother, incredibly proud. She used to be an affectionate, sweet child, and I spent hours playing with her. But she means nothing to me now. She's 15 or 16, very handsome and highly accomplished. Since her father died, she's lived in London with a lady who oversees her education. After several shifts in conversation, Elizabeth circled back to her main source of confusion. I'm still baffled by his friendship with Mr. Bingley. Mr. Bingley is the sweetest, most genuinely amiable man. How can they possibly tolerate each other? Do you know Mr. Bingley? Not at all. He's charming. He can't possibly know what Mr. Darcy is really like. Probably not, but Darcy can be pleasant when he wants to be. He isn't stupid. If he thinks you're worth his time, he's a good companion. With his wealthy equals, he is an entirely different man, liberal, just, honorable, and even agreeable. He saves his arrogance for everyone else. The whist game broke up shortly after, and the players drifted over to the lottery table. Mr. Collins wedged himself between Elizabeth and Mrs. Phillips. When his aunt asked how he had fared, he admitted with intense gravity that he had lost every single point, but he urged her not to worry on his behalf. I assure you, madam, anyone who sits down to cards must accept the risk. Fortunately, 5 shillings means absolutely nothing in my current station. Others might worry over such a trifle, but thanks to Lady Catherine de Bourgh, I am far beyond caring about petty losses. Wickham looked up, studying the clergyman for a moment before leaning close to Elizabeth. Are your relatives intimately acquainted with the de Bourgh family? He asked quietly. Lady Catherine recently gave him a living, Elizabeth replied. I'm not sure how they met, but he certainly hasn't known her for long. You do know that Lady Catherine and Lady Anne Darcy were sisters, I assume, which makes her Mr. Darcy's aunt. I had no idea. I knew nothing of her connections. I only heard her name for the first time 2 days ago. Her daughter, Miss de Bourgh, will inherit a massive fortune. Everyone expects the 2 cousins to marry and unite the estates. Elizabeth couldn't help but smile, thinking of Caroline Bingley. All of Miss Bingley's desperate flattery, her feigned affection for Darcy's sister, and her endless praise for Darcy himself would be completely wasted if he were already destined to marry his own cousin. Mr. Collins speaks highly of them both, Elizabeth noted, but from the stories he's told, I think his gratitude makes him blind. Despite her generosity to him, she sounds like an arrogant, conceited woman. I believe she is exactly that, Wickham agreed. I haven't seen her in years, but I remember her dictatorial, insolent manners perfectly. People say she's remarkably clever, but I suspect her reputation comes mostly from her wealth, her bossy attitude, and her nephew's absolute insistence that anyone related to him must have a first-class mind. Elizabeth was entirely satisfied with this logic, and they talked happily until supper interrupted the cards, forcing Wickham to share his charm with the rest of the room. The noise of Mrs. Phillips's supper party made real conversation impossible, but Wickham's perfect manners won over everyone at the table. Whatever he said was clever, and whatever he did was graceful. When Elizabeth finally left for home, her head was spinning with thoughts of him. Throughout the carriage ride, she pondered everything he had revealed. She didn't even have a chance to say his name aloud, because Lydia and Mr. Collins never stopped talking. Lydia shouted endlessly about lottery tickets, detailing exactly how many fish tokens she had won and lost. Meanwhile, Mr. Collins droned on about his host's hospitality, recited the specific dishes served at supper, insisted repeatedly that he didn't care about his whist losses, and issued constant, paranoid apologies for taking up too much room on the carriage seat. He was still apologizing as they finally pulled up to the doors of Longbourn House. Chapter XVII. The next morning, Elizabeth recounted her entire conversation with Mr. Wickham to Jane. Jane listened with deep concern and sheer astonishment. She simply couldn't fathom that Mr. Darcy would prove so unworthy of Mr. Bingley's friendship. Yet, true to her trusting nature, she couldn't bear to doubt a young man as agreeable as Mr. Wickham. The mere thought that he had suffered such cruelty engaged all her sympathies. Left with no other option, Jane did what she always did. She decided to think the best of everyone. She assumed the two men were both victims of a terrible misunderstanding. They must have both been deceived, Jane reasoned. Perhaps malicious people have misrepresented them to one another. I simply cannot imagine any other reason they would be driven apart without actual blame falling on either side. Elizabeth smiled. That is a very generous theory, Jane. But what about these malicious people you've just invented? You had better clear their names, too, or we shall be forced to think poorly of somebody. You can laugh at me all you want, Lizzie, but you won't change my mind. Just think of the disgraceful light this casts on Mr. Darcy. To treat his own father's favorite, a man his father swore to provide for, with such cold malice, it is impossible. No man with a shred of humanity or respect for his own reputation could do it. Do you really believe his closest friends could be so entirely wrong about him? No. I find it much easier to believe Mr. Bingley has been fooled than to think Mr. Wickham invented that entire tragic history out of thin air, Elizabeth countered. He gave me names, facts, and dates without a moment's hesitation. If it is a lie, let Mr. Darcy step forward and contradict it. Besides, there was truth in Wickham's face. Jane sighed, looking deeply troubled. It is so distressing, I truly do not know what to think. I beg your pardon, Elizabeth said gently, but one knows exactly what to think. The only thing Jane felt certain about was that, if Mr. Bingley really had been deceived by his friend, he would be heartbroken when the truth finally came out. The sisters' conversation in the shrubbery was suddenly interrupted by the very people they were discussing. Mr. Bingley and his sisters appeared on the path, having come to deliver a personal invitation to the long-awaited ball at Netherfield. The date was firmly set for the following Tuesday. Caroline Bingley and Mrs. Hurst were overjoyed to see Jane. They declared it had been an absolute eternity since they last met and demanded to know everything she had been doing with her time. The rest of the Bennet family, however, barely warranted a glance. The wealthy sisters actively avoided Mrs. Bennet, offered only a few polite words to Elizabeth, and completely ignored the younger girls. As soon as the invitation was delivered, the two women stood up with a sudden speed that startled even their brother, practically sprinting away to escape Mrs. Bennet's suffocating hospitality. The upcoming ball instantly became the sole focus of every woman in the house. Mrs. Bennet was convinced the event was being thrown entirely in Jane's honor, highly flattered that Mr. Bingley had delivered the invitation in person rather than sending a formal card. Jane looked forward to a perfect evening with her two friends and the warm attentions of their brother. Elizabeth was equally thrilled, anticipating a long night of dancing with Mr. Wickham, and the deep satisfaction of watching Mr. Darcy's guilty reactions to the man he had wronged. Catherine and Lydia were less particular. While they fully intended to claim Mr. Wickham for at least half the night, any willing partner would do. A ball was a ball, and they asked for nothing more. Even Mary gave her stoic blessing to the event. "As long as I have my mornings to myself," she announced to her family, "I consider it no great sacrifice to occasionally join in evening engagements. Society has its claims on all of us, and I have always maintained that brief intervals of recreation are beneficial for everyone." Elizabeth was in such wonderful spirits that she broke her usual rule of speaking to Mr. Collins only when absolutely necessary. She playfully asked if he intended to accept the Netherfield invitation, and if so, whether he thought it proper for a clergyman to actually dance. To her surprise, he didn't harbor a single hesitation. He wasn't the least bit worried about facing a rebuke from his archbishop or the formidable Lady Catherine de Bourgh. "I assure you, cousin," Mr. Collins said with great self-importance, "a ball of this nature, hosted by a respectable young man for respectable people, can have no evil tendency. I have no objections to dancing. In fact, I fully intend to ask all my fair cousins for the honor of a dance. And I will take this opportunity to claim you, Miss Elizabeth, for the first 2 dances of the evening." I trust Jane will understand this preference and not view it as a slight. Elizabeth realized, too late, that she had completely trapped herself. She had been saving those exact dances for Mr. Wickham. Now she was stuck with Mr. Collins. Her playful mood had backfired horribly. Trapped by manners, she accepted his request as gracefully as she could manage, knowing her time with Wickham would have to wait. But the clergyman's sudden gallantry sparked a new, much more terrifying realization. He had chosen her over her sisters. He clearly viewed her as the future mistress of Hunsford Parsonage, the woman who would make up a card table for Lady Catherine when proper guests were lacking. As the afternoon wore on, this dreadful suspicion hardened into certainty. Mr. Collins showered her with awkward attention and made clumsy attempts to compliment her wit and vivacity. Elizabeth was more bewildered than flattered, and her mother soon made it painfully clear that a marriage between them would be a wonderful outcome. Elizabeth wisely chose to ignore the heavy hints. If she spoke up now, a massive argument with her mother was inevitable. Better to wait. Mr. Collins hadn't actually proposed yet, and there was no sense fighting about him until he did. Had it not been for the Netherfield ball, the younger Bennet girls would have died of boredom over the next few days. From the moment the invitation was issued until the Tuesday of the event, unrelenting rain kept everyone trapped indoors. There were no walks to Meryton, no visits to their aunt, no flirting with officers, and absolutely no fresh gossip. They even had to buy their decorative roses by sending a servant in their place. The foul weather tested even Elizabeth's patience, completely stalling her budding romance with Mr. Wickham. And for Kitty and Lydia, nothing short of a ball could have made such a miserable, housebound stretch of Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and Monday even remotely endurable. Chapter XVII. Until Elizabeth stepped into the drawing room at Netherfield and searched the cluster of red coats in vain, it had never occurred to her that Mr. Wickham might not be there. She had dressed with unusual care, her spirits soaring at the prospect of winning whatever remained unsubdued of his heart. She had been certain that the evening's progress would make him entirely her own. But in an instant, a dreadful suspicion struck her. He had been purposefully omitted from the Bingleys' invitation to please Mr. Darcy. While that was not exactly true, his absence was an absolute fact. Mr. Denny, cornered eagerly by Lydia, informed them that Wickham had been obliged to go to town on business the day before and had not yet returned. Denny added, with a highly significant smile, "I do not imagine his business would have called him away just now if he had not wished to avoid a certain gentleman here." Though Lydia missed the implication entirely, Elizabeth caught every word. It confirmed her worst fear. Darcy was just as responsible for Wickham's absence as if her first suspicion had been correct. Her displeasure sharpened into acute, immediate disappointment. When Darcy approached soon after to make polite inquiries, she could barely summon enough civility to answer him. To show patience or forbearance toward Darcy felt like a betrayal of Wickham. She resolved to have nothing to do with the man, turning away with a profound ill humor that she could not shake even when speaking to Mr. Bingley, whose blind partiality to Darcy only provoked her further. But Elizabeth was not built for sustained resentment. Though her own romantic prospects for the evening were ruined, the gloom could not hold her for long. After unburdening all her griefs to Charlotte Lucas, whom she had not seen for a week, she found herself able to shift her attention to her cousin's eccentricities, eagerly pointing Mr. Collins out for Charlotte's amusement. The first 2 dances, however, brought a swift return to misery. They were dances of pure mortification. Awkward and solemn, Mr. Collins spent the entire time apologizing instead of paying attention to the steps, frequently moving in the wrong direction without even realizing it. He subjected her to all the shame and agony that only a truly disastrous partner can inflict. The moment she was released from him was pure ecstasy. She danced next with an officer, which offered the immense relief of talking about Wickham and hearing him universally praised. When the set ended, she returned to Charlotte Lucas. They were deep in conversation when Elizabeth found herself suddenly addressed by Mr. Darcy. He took her so entirely by surprise in asking for her hand that, before she even knew what she was doing, she accepted. He walked away immediately, leaving Elizabeth to fret over her total lack of presence of mind. Charlotte tried to comfort her. "I dare say you will find him very agreeable," she said. "Heaven forbid, that would be the worst misfortune of all. To find a man agreeable when one is absolutely determined to hate him. Do not wish such an evil on me." When the music recommenced and Darcy approached to claim her, Charlotte could not resist a whispered warning. She urged Elizabeth not to be a simpleton, and not to let her fancy for Wickham make her obnoxious in the eyes of a man with 10 times his consequence. Elizabeth made no reply. She took her place in the set, genuinely astonished by the grand dignity of standing opposite Mr. Darcy and reading in equal amazement in the faces of her neighbors. They stood for some time without speaking a single word. At first, she imagined their silence might stretch through both dances, and she resolved not to be the one to break it. But then, fancying it would be a far greater punishment to force her partner to speak, she made a slight observation about the dance. He replied and fell silent again. After a pause of several minutes, she addressed him a second time. "It is your turn to say something now, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, and you ought to make some kind of remark on the size of the room or the number of couples." He smiled and assured her that whatever she wished him to say, he would say. "Very well, that reply will do for the present. Perhaps, by and by, I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but for now, we may be silent." "Do you talk by rule, then, while you are dancing?" "Sometimes. One must speak a little, you know. It would look odd to be entirely silent for half an hour together. And yet, for the benefit of certain people, conversation ought to be so arranged that they may have the trouble of saying as little as possible." "Are you consulting your own feelings in the present case?" Darcy asked. "Or do you imagine that you are gratifying mine?" "Both," Elizabeth replied archly. "For I have always seen a great similarity in the turn of our minds. We are both of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak, unless we expect to say something that will amaze the entire room and be handed down to posterity with all the brilliance of a proverb." "That is no very striking resemblance of your own character, I am sure," he said. "How near it may be to mine, I cannot pretend to say, but you think it a faithful portrait, undoubtedly." "I must not judge my own performance." He made no answer, and they danced in silence until they reached the bottom of the set. Then, he asked if she and her sisters did not very often walk to Meryton. She answered that they did, and, unable to resist the temptation, added, "When you met us there the other day, we had just been forming a new acquaintance." The effect was instantaneous. A deep shadow of haughty reserve overspread his features. He said nothing, and Elizabeth, though instantly blaming herself for her own weakness in baiting him, could not bring herself to continue. At length, Darcy spoke in a tightly constrained manner. "Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as may ensure his making friends. Whether he is equally capable of retaining them is less certain." "He has been so unlucky as to lose your friendship," Elizabeth replied with pointed emphasis, "and in a manner which he is likely to suffer from all his life." Darcy gave no answer, clearly desiring to change the subject. Just then, Sir William Lucas appeared close to them, intending to cross through the set. But upon noticing Mr. Darcy, he stopped, executing a bow of elaborate courtesy to compliment him on his dancing and his partner. "I have been most highly gratified indeed, my dear sir. Such very superior dancing is not often seen. It is evident that you belong to the first circles. Allow me to say, however, that your fair partner does not disgrace you. I must hope to have this pleasure often repeated, especially when a certain desirable event, my dear Miss Eliza, he said, glancing conspicuously across the room at Jane and Bingley, shall take place. What congratulations will then flow in? I appeal to Mr. Darcy, but let me not interrupt you, sir. You will not thank me for detaining you from the bewitching conversation of that young lady, whose bright eyes are already upbraiding me. Darcy scarcely heard the end of this address. Sir William's heavy-handed allusion to his friend seemed to strike him powerfully. His eyes fixed with a sudden, intense seriousness upon Bingley and Jane, who were dancing together. Recovering himself a moment later, he turned back to Elizabeth. Sir William's interruption has made me forget what we were talking of. I do not think we were speaking at all, she said. Sir William could not have interrupted any two people in the room who had less to say for themselves. We have tried 2 or 3 subjects already without success, and what we are to talk of next, I cannot imagine. What think you of books? He asked, smiling. Books? Oh no, I am sure we never read the same ones, or at least not with the same feelings. I am sorry you think so, but if that is the case, there can at least be no shortage of material. We may compare our different opinions. No, I cannot talk of books in a ballroom. My head is always full of something else. The present always occupies you in such scenes, does it? He asked, studying her with a look of doubt. Yes, always, she replied, hardly knowing what she was saying, for her own thoughts had already wandered far from the present moment. This became obvious when she suddenly exclaimed, I remember hearing you once say, Mr. Darcy, that you hardly ever forgave, that your resentment once created was unappeasable. You are very cautious, I suppose, about allowing it to be created. I am, he said in a firm voice. And you never allow yourself to be blinded by prejudice. I hope not. It is particularly important for those who never change their opinion, to be absolutely secure of judging properly at first. May I ask to what these questions tend? Merely to the illustration of your character, she said, trying to shake off her own gravity. I am trying to make it out. And what is your success? She shook her head. I do not get on at all. I hear such remarkably different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly. I can readily believe, he answered gravely, that reports may vary greatly with respect to me. And I could wish, Miss Bennet, that you were not to sketch my character at the present moment, as there is reason to fear that the performance would reflect no credit on either of us. But if I do not take your likeness now, I may never have another opportunity. I would by no means suspend any pleasure of yours, he replied coldly. She said no more, and they finished the dance and parted in silence. Both were dissatisfied, though not to an equal degree. In Darcy's breast, there remained a tolerably powerful feeling toward her, which soon secured her pardon, and directed all his anger toward someone else. They had not been separated long when Miss Bingley approached. With an expression of civilized disdain, she accosted Elizabeth. So, Miss Eliza, I hear you are quite delighted with George Wickham? Your sister has been talking to me about him, and asking me 1,000 questions. I find that the young man forgot to tell you, among his other communications, that he is the son of old Wickham, the late Mr. Darcy's steward. Let me recommend you, however, as a friend, not to give implicit confidence to all his assertions. For as to Mr. Darcy using him ill, it is perfectly false. On the contrary, he has always been remarkably kind to him, though George Wickham has treated Mr. Darcy in a most infamous manner. I do not know the exact particulars, but I know very well that Mr. Darcy is not in the least to blame, that he cannot bear to hear George Wickham mentioned, and that though my brother felt he could not well avoid including him in the invitation to the officers, he was excessively glad to find the man had taken himself out of the way. His coming into this county at all is a most insolent thing, and I wonder how he could presume to do it. I pity you, Miss Eliza, for this discovery of your favourite's guilt, but really, considering his descent, one could not expect much better. His guilt and his descent appear, by your own account, to be exactly the same, Elizabeth replied angrily. For I have heard you accuse him of nothing worse than being the son of Mr. Darcy's steward, and of that, I assure you, he informed me himself. I beg your pardon, Miss Bingley replied, turning away with a sneer. Excuse my interference, it was kindly meant. Insolent girl, Elizabeth thought. You are much mistaken if you expect to influence me by such a paltry attack. I see nothing in it but your own willful ignorance and the malice of Mr. Darcy." She then went in search of her eldest sister, who had undertaken to quietly question Bingley on the matter. Jane met her with a smile of such sweet complacency and a glow of such unmistakable happiness that it was obvious how entirely satisfied she was with the evening. Elizabeth instantly read her sister's heart. In that moment, her anxiety for Wickham, her resentment toward his enemies, and everything else gave way to the soaring hope that Jane was on the verge of total happiness. "I want to know," Elizabeth said, her own face reflecting her sister's bright smile, "what you have learned about Mr. Wickham. But perhaps you have been too pleasantly engaged to think of any third person, in which case I will readily forgive you." "No," Jane said gently, "I have not forgotten him, but I have nothing satisfactory to tell you. Mr. Bingley does not know the whole of his history and is quite ignorant of the circumstances that have principally offended Mr. Darcy, but he will vouch for the good conduct, the probity, and the honor of his friend. He is perfectly convinced that Mr. Wickham has deserved much less attention from Mr. Darcy than he has received, and I am sorry to say that by his account, as well as his sister, Mr. Wickham is by no means a respectable young man. I am afraid he has been very imprudent and has deserved to lose Mr. Darcy's regard." "Mr. Bingley does not know Mr. Wickham himself, does he?" "No, he never saw him until the other morning at Meryton." "Then this account is merely what he has received from Mr. Darcy. I am perfectly satisfied. But what does he say of the church living?" "He does not exactly recall the circumstances, though he has heard them from Mr. Darcy more than once. But he believes that it was left to him conditionally only." "I have not a doubt of Mr. Bingley's sincerity," Elizabeth said warmly, "but you must excuse my not being convinced by second-hand assurances. Mr. Bingley's defense of his friend was a very able one, I dare say, but since he is unacquainted with several parts of the story, and has learned the rest from Darcy himself, I shall venture to keep the same opinion of both gentlemen that I had before." She then changed the subject to one infinitely more gratifying, and on which there could be no difference of sentiment. Elizabeth listened with delight to the happy, modest hopes Jane entertained of Bingley's affection, and did everything in her power to heighten Jane's confidence in it. When Mr. Bingley himself joined them, Elizabeth gracefully withdrew to find Miss Lucas. She had barely asked Charlotte how she was enjoying her latest partner when Mr. Collins hurried up to them. He announced, with profound exultation, that he had just made a most important discovery. "I have found out by a singular accident that there is now in the room a near relation of my patroness," he proclaimed. "I happened to overhear the gentleman himself mentioning to the young lady who does the honors of this house the names of his cousin, Miss de Bourgh, and of her mother, Lady Catherine. How wonderfully these sorts of things occur! Who would have thought of my meeting with, perhaps, a nephew of Lady Catherine de Bourgh in this very assembly? I am most thankful that the discovery is made in time for me to pay my respects to him, which I am now going to do. I trust he will excuse my not having done so before. My total ignorance of the connection must plead my apology." "You are not going to introduce yourself to Mr. Darcy?" Elizabeth asked in horror. "Indeed I am. I shall entreat his pardon for not having done it earlier. I believe him to be Lady Catherine's nephew. It will be in my power to assure him that her ladyship was quite well just a week ago yesterday." Elizabeth tried desperately to dissuade him. She warned him that Mr. Darcy would consider a stranger addressing him without a formal introduction to be an impertinent liberty rather than a compliment to his aunt. She insisted that no notice was necessary on either side, and that if any were, it must be initiated by Mr. Darcy, as the superior in social consequence. Mr. Collins listened with the stubborn air of a man determined to follow his own whims. When she finally stopped speaking, he replied, "My dear Miss Elizabeth, I have the highest opinion in the world of your excellent judgment in all matters within the scope of your understanding. But permit me to say that there must be a wide difference between the established forms of ceremony among the laity and those which regulate the clergy. Give me leave to observe that I consider the clerical office as equal in point of dignity with the highest rank in the kingdom, provided that a proper humility of behavior is maintained at the same time. You must, therefore, allow me to follow the dictates of my conscience on this occasion, which lead me to perform what I look on as a point of duty. Pardon me for neglecting to profit by your advice, which on every other subject shall be my constant guide. But in the case before us, I consider myself more fitted by education and habitual study to decide on what is right than a young lady like yourself." With a low bow, he marched off to attack Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth eagerly watched Darcy's reception of the advance. His astonishment at being addressed by the man was perfectly evident. Her cousin prefaced his speech with a solemn bow, and though Elizabeth could not hear a single word, she felt as if she were hearing it all. She could read the words apology, Hunsford, and Lady Catherine de Bourgh right on his moving lips. It vexed her terribly to see him expose himself to such a man. Darcy eyed the clergyman with unrestrained wonder. When Mr. Collins finally paused long enough to allow him to speak, Darcy replied with an air of distant, freezing civility. Mr. Collins, however, was not easily discouraged, and immediately began speaking again. Darcy's contempt seemed to increase in direct proportion to the length of this second speech. At the end of it, Darcy offered only a slight bow and walked away to another part of the room. Mr. Collins then returned to Elizabeth. "I have no reason, I assure you, to be dissatisfied with my reception," he told her proudly. Mr. Darcy seemed much pleased with the attention. He answered me with the utmost civility, and even paid me the compliment of saying that he was so well convinced of Lady Catherine's discernment as to be certain she could never bestow a favor unworthily. It was really a very handsome thought. Upon the whole, I am much pleased with him. As Elizabeth had no more personal interests to pursue that evening, she turned her attention almost entirely to her sister and Mr. Bingley. The train of agreeable reflections sparked by watching them made her almost as happy as Jane herself. In her mind's eye, she saw Jane settled at Netherfield, enjoying all the felicity that a marriage of true affection could bestow. Under such circumstances, she felt capable of even trying to like Bingley's two sisters. She could plainly see that her mother's thoughts were running along the exact same lines, and so she deliberately avoided her, terrified of hearing too much. Therefore, when they all sat down to supper, Elizabeth considered it a stroke of cursed luck that placed her directly next to her mother. She was deeply mortified to find that Mrs. Bennet was talking to Lady Lucas freely, openly, and loudly about absolutely nothing else but her expectation that Jane would soon be married to Mr. Bingley. It was a thrilling subject, and Mrs. Bennet seemed immune to fatigue as she enumerated the match's many advantages. The fact that he was such a charming young man, so rich, and living a mere 3 miles from Longbourn were her first points of self-congratulation. Then it was such a comfort to think of how fond Bingley's sisters were of Jane, and how certain she was that they desired the connection just as much. Moreover, it was a highly promising thing for her younger daughters, as Jane's spectacular marriage would naturally throw them into the paths of other rich men. And lastly, it was simply so pleasant, at her time of life, to be able to dump her single daughters into the care of their married sister, so she would not be forced to go out into society more than she pleased. It was necessary to pretend this was a great relief, because etiquette demanded it, though no one on earth was less likely than Mrs. Bennet to find comfort in staying home. She concluded with many loud, charitable wishes that Lady Lucas might soon be equally fortunate, while projecting a triumphant, unshakable belief that Lady Lucas had no chance of it whatsoever. Elizabeth tried in vain to check the rapid flow of her mother's words, begging her in frantic whispers to describe her felicity in a lower tone. To her inexpressible vexation, she could see that the bulk of the speech was being easily overheard by Mr. Darcy, who sat directly opposite them. Her mother merely scolded her for being nonsensical. "What is Mr. Darcy to me, pray, that I should be afraid of him? I am sure we owe him no such particular civility as to be obliged to say nothing he may not like to hear. For heaven's sake, madam, speak lower. What advantage can it be to you to offend Mr. Darcy? You will never recommend yourself to his friend by doing so." Nothing Elizabeth said had the slightest effect. Mrs. Bennet continued to broadcast her views in the exact same carrying tone. Elizabeth blushed and blushed again, burning with shame. She could not stop herself from glancing across the table at Mr. Darcy, and every glance confirmed her worst dread. Though he was not always looking directly at Mrs. Bennet, his attention was unmistakably fixed upon her. The expression on his face morphed gradually from indignant contempt to a composed, unyielding gravity. At long last, Mrs. Bennet ran out of things to say. Lady Lucas, who had been openly yawning at this parade of delights she had no hope of sharing, was left to the quiet comforts of cold ham and chicken. Elizabeth finally began to breathe again. But her tranquility was short-lived. The moment supper ended, someone mentioned singing, and Elizabeth suffered the profound mortification of seeing Mary, after very little entreaty, preparing to oblige the company. With frantic gestures and desperate silent pleas, Elizabeth tried to prevent this display, but in vain. Mary refused to understand them. Such a chance to exhibit herself was too delightful to pass up, and she began her song. Elizabeth's eyes locked onto her sister with painful intensity. She watched Mary's progress through the stanzas with an impatience that was bitterly rewarded at the end. For Mary, receiving some polite thanks from the table and a vague hint that they hoped she might favor them again, paused for precisely half a minute before launching into a second song. Mary's powers were entirely unsuited for such an exhibition. Her voice was weak, and her manner painfully affected. Elizabeth sat in agony. She looked at Jane to see how she was bearing it, but Jane was peacefully talking to Bingley. She looked at his two sisters and saw them exchanging mocking signs of derision. She looked at Darcy, who remained impenetrably grave. Finally, she looked at her father, desperately entreating him to interfere before Mary decided to sing all night. Mr. Bennet took the hint. When Mary finished her second song, he said loudly, "That will do extremely well, child. You have delighted us long enough. Let the other young ladies have time to exhibit." Mary, though pretending she had not heard, looked rather disconcerted. Elizabeth, sorry for her sister and wincing at her father's bluntness, feared her own anxiety had done more harm than good. The room's attention shifted to other guests. "If I," Mr. Collins suddenly announced to the room at large, "were so fortunate as to be able to sing, I should have great pleasure, I am sure, in obliging the company with an air. For I consider music a very innocent diversion and perfectly compatible with the profession of a clergyman. I do not mean to assert that we can be justified in devoting too much of our time to music, for there are certainly other things to be attended to. The rector of a parish has much to do. In the first place, he must make such an agreement for tithes as may be beneficial to himself and not offensive to his patron. He must write his own sermons. And the time that remains will not be too much for his parish duties, and the care and improvement of his dwelling, which he cannot be excused from making as comfortable as possible. And I do not think it of light importance that he should have attentive and conciliatory manners toward everybody, especially toward those to whom he owes his preferment. I cannot acquit him of that duty, nor could I think well of any man who should omit an occasion of testifying his respect toward anybody connected with the family." With a solemn bow to Mr. Darcy, he concluded this speech, which he had delivered so loudly that half the room heard every word. Many stared, many smiled, but no one looked more highly amused than Mr. Bennet himself. His wife, meanwhile, seriously commended Mr. Collins for having spoken so sensibly, whispering loudly to Lady Lucas that he was a remarkably clever, good kind of young man. To Elizabeth, it felt as though her family had signed a formal pact to expose themselves to as much ridicule as humanly possible in a single evening. They could not have played their parts with more spirit or finer success. She considered it incredibly lucky for Jane that Bingley had missed some of the exhibition, and that his nature was not the sort to be overly distressed by the folly he did witness. But that his two sisters and Mr. Darcy should be handed such a perfect opportunity to mock her relations was almost too much to bear. She truly could not decide which was worse, the silent, icy contempt of the gentlemen or the insolent, sneering smiles of the ladies. The remainder of the evening offered her little relief. She was tormented by Mr. Collins, who stuck perseveringly by her side. Though he could not convince her to dance with him again, his looming presence made it impossible for her to dance with anyone else. She tried in vain to persuade him to stand up with someone else, offering to introduce him to any young lady in the room. He simply assured her that he was perfectly indifferent to dancing. His chief object was to recommend himself to her through delicate attentions, and he would therefore make a point of remaining close to her all night. There was no arguing with such a terrifying project. Her only salvation was her friend Miss Lucas, who frequently joined them and good-naturedly absorbed Mr. Collins into conversation. Elizabeth was at least free from the offense of Mr. Darcy's further notice. Though he frequently stood just a few feet away, entirely disengaged, he never came near enough to speak to her. She assumed this was the consequence of her pointed remarks about Mr. Wickham, and she rejoiced in it. The Longbourn party was the very last to depart. Thanks to a deliberate maneuver by Mrs. Bennet, they were forced to wait for their carriage a full 15 minutes after every other guest had gone. This provided them ample time to see just how desperately the remaining family wished them gone. Mrs. Hurst and her sister barely opened their mouths except to complain of exhaustion, making their impatience to have the house to themselves painfully obvious. They repulsed every attempt Mrs. Bennet made at conversation, throwing a heavy chill over the group. This awkward silence was broken only by the long, droning speeches of Mr. Collins, who continually complimented Mr. Bingley and his sisters on the elegance of their entertainment and the grand hospitality that had marked their behavior. Darcy said absolutely nothing. Mr. Bennet sat in equal silence, quietly enjoying the absurd scene. Mr. Bingley and Jane stood together a little apart from the rest, talking only to each other. Elizabeth maintained a silence as stony as Mrs. Hurst or Miss Bingley. Even Lydia was too exhausted to do anything but occasionally exclaim, "Lord, how tired I am," followed by a violent yawn. When they finally rose to take their leave, Mrs. Bennet was aggressively civil. She pressed her hopes of seeing the whole family soon at Longbourn, addressing herself particularly to Mr. Bingley. She assured him of how happy he would make them by eating a simple family dinner with them at any time, entirely without the ceremony of a formal invitation. Bingley was full of grateful pleasure. He readily promised to take the earliest possible opportunity to call on her after his return from London, where he was obliged to go the very next day for a short trip. Mrs. Bennet left the house perfectly satisfied. She rode home under the delightful conviction that, allowing for the necessary time to draw up settlements, order new carriages, and sew wedding clothes, she would undoubtedly see her eldest daughter settled at Netherfield in 3 or 4 months' time. She thought of having a second daughter married to Mr. Collins with equal certainty, and with considerable, if slightly less, pleasure. Elizabeth was the least dear to her of all her children. While she felt that both the man and the match were quite good enough for her, the worth of both was completely eclipsed by Mr. Bingley and the grandeur of Netherfield.